started. I see that the event recording is now in progress. So let me start out by saying welcome to today's Track 3B2 workshop. This workshop is going to be covering the topic of forward energy. And my name is Jamie Gannon. I work in the Resource Adequacy and Procurement section of Energy Division. I'm also joined by Michelle Keto, Simone Brandt, and Lenon Chow from Energy Division, who will be helping to facilitate today's workshop. I'm also graciously joined by Frank Wollock from Stanford University and James Bushnell from UC Davis and Sean McRae from ITAM. Thank you so much for being here today. They are going to be our academic panel. And I've also been informed that President Batcher from the CPUC will be joining us. And when we do identify her, we will bring her in and she may give a few words. Frank, will you move to the next slide? Thanks. So as I noted, the workshop today is being recorded, and this recording will be posted on the Energy Division's RA History website following the workshop. The agenda and material will also be provided at that same website link. We ask that for safety reasons, you note your surroundings and your emergency exits, as well as do an ergonomic check. And excuse me, as in the past, all attendees have been muted, and the panelists that will be speaking for each topic will be identified in the attendee list prior to their topic being discussed, and we'll make them panelists. And for those who are just attendees today who will not be panelists, we ask that you ask your questions through the Q&A function. That Q&A function is reflected at the bottom, the lower right bottom of the screen there. You could click the three dots to get to it. And for the first part of the workshop, when Frank is presenting, we ask that you keep your questions to clarifying only questions that we could potentially address throughout the presentation. The more technical questions, we ask that you leave those for the Q&A section of the workshop, which is at the latter part of the workshop. You would just put your question in the Q&A box and then send to all panelists, or you can raise your hand. Once the questions have been received, Simone Brandt is going to be monitoring them, and she will read them aloud. She may ask the attendee may be unmuted to provide a response to the answer. But if that is the case, we ask that you mute yourself back after. Okay, so let me jump into a few ground rules. The workshop is structured to stimulate an honest dialogue and engage different perspectives. So we ask that all participants keep their comments friendly and respectful. Again, we ask that you use the Q&A function and not the chat function. So we're asking that you don't have sidebar conversations or respond to sidebar conversations in the chat function. Okay, so now I'm just going to briefly go through today's agenda. So the first part of today's agenda is an introduction by Energy Division. This will be followed by a presentation from Frank Wollock on the proposal that was submitted by Energy Division staff into Track 3B of the RA proceeding. Once Frank has wrapped up his presentation, we'll hear from Bushnell and Sean McRae, our academic panelist, who will give an initial response to the proposal. And then we'll break for about 15 minutes. We will return from our break, and we are going to be joined by Nick Pappas from CalCCA, Peter Griffiths from PG&E, Matt Barmack from Calpine, and Eric Little from Southern California Edison. They are our party panelists where they've been asked to provide key questions or come prepared with key questions about the proposal. And we're also asking that the academic panelists stay on for this section so that they could also be engaged in a discussion about the issues or questions raised from parties. And so we'll wrap up this party panelist panel around 11:55, and then for the next half an hour we'll have Q&A from attendees, and then we'll conclude with some next steps. We'll cover the schedule for comments and the remaining Track 3B2 schedule. So just as a reminder, on December 11th, the Commission issued a revised scoping memo. The scoping memo divided Track 3B into two subtracks. Track 3B2 was identified as the track that would examine the broader RA structural capacity issues. This was initially the scope of Track 3B proceeding, but given the overwhelming amount of proposals that were filed in Track 3B, the Commission saw it best to divide the proceeding into two subtracks. So this new subtrack is going to specifically address the direction the Commission intends to move in with respect to the larger structural changes. And the calendar, the schedule reflects a June 2021 decision, of which the Commission will or intends to address the direction that it plans to move in. And then it lists an example of whether or not we should move in a capacity construct, we should move forward with a capacity construct that addresses energy attributes and the reliance on used and limited resources, or a forward energy construct. And the decision will also hopes to address or set forth the necessary milestones to determine, or the necessary milestones and additional details that must be determined in order to implement the adopted direction for a compliance year no earlier than 2023. So the goals of today's workshop, the primary goal is to provide parties and decision makers with a better understanding of what a forward energy reliability construct is, and the focus will be on the revised staff proposal titled Long-Term Resource Adequacy in an Intermittent, Renewable, and Import-Dependent Future in California. This paper was authored by Frank Willock, who will be presenting it today, and it was put forward as a staff proposal in the RA Track 3B proceeding. Secondary goals are to receive feedback from the academic panel as well as the party panel, and to also provide parties with an opportunity to ask questions in order to help them understand the proposal better. So next I'm going to turn it over to Michelle Quito, who's going to go through some of the primary drivers that are leading to the problem that we're trying to solve in the Track 3B2 proceeding.
Thanks, Jamie.
I have, Michelle and Jamie, I've joined, by the way. This is Maribel.
Hi, Maribel. Thank you, thank you, Commissioner Batcher, or President Batcher. Do you want to give a few words before we jump into the problem statement, or would you like to do so after we go through the problem statement?
Why don't I just, so we don't break up after the problem statement, if Michelle's okay with me just saying a few words now, that would be great.
Great.
Okay, good. Well, with that then, sorry, I had trouble getting in the WebEx for some reason this morning. So I do want to say good morning to everyone, and I'm very pleased that we are all here today, and very much looking forward to hearing from our esteemed guests on the Forward Energy Contracting Framework. I will apologize in advance. I've got a jam-packed schedule today, so I will be in and out. I'm trying to be with you during the more important aspects of the agenda. So you know, this is a challenging and technical topic, and I'm so glad that the Energy Division staff has arranged this workshop for us. And really important. I'm sure it's going to be a lot of good food for thought today. And while not the topic of today's workshop, I wanted to take a moment to also speak to a different but related priority of mine and for the Commission, and that is ensuring the reliability of the grid for the summer of 2021 and beyond. As everyone here is very well aware, the extreme heat events of last August led to the rolling outages, the kind of which I ensure we are not going to be doing again, and we're doing everything in our powers to ensure we will not be repeating that. We have opened an expedited summer 2021 reliability proceeding here at the Commission that is moving at lightning speed. I know that's hard for some people to grasp, but it's absolutely essential that it move quickly, because we know that to enable the demand side and the supply side solutions we need for 2021, we need to act now. The practical realities of starting new demand response programs and making the adjustments to the existing programs means we'll need to approve changes within the next couple months, and we are on track to do that. We asked the parties to provide proposals on demand side solutions that can be brought in. We asked that in December, and we'll be getting those proposals Monday. We expect to have a decision on this in March. We also issued, a ruling telling the utilities to go out and see what incremental capacity they could contract for from existing resources. Well, that ruling went out first. I assure you, the supply side is not a priority over the demand side, and I firmly believe that we very much need and will rely on demand side resources for next summer. So I look forward to seeing those proposals on Monday. And thank you all for the opportunity to say a few words this morning, since I know so many of you doing the important thinking around our resource adequacy program and rules. And are very much following and involved in our thinking around summer 2021. I wanted to just give you those brief words. So Jamie and Michelle, thank you for just a little opportunity to speak today. And I'll try not to be disruptive as I come in and go during the course of the morning. Thank you all.
Thank you, President Batcher, for those words. So Michelle, do you want to go through a recap of some of the key challenges that are driving the need for structural change in the resource adequacy framework?
Sure. Thanks, Jamie. So I'm just going to talk about broadly some of the things that we've been concerned about and we've been raising in the papers that we've issued over the last year. So the first thing we want to note is that we all recognize that we're having reduced reserve margins. So starting out in the early 2010 area, we might have had reserve margins %. As you know, those reserve margins have decreased dramatically. And in particular, I just want to note that those have decreased on a net qualifying basis. So for example, where we might have counted hydro at its full max PMAX, we recognize that the hydro isn't able to reach its PMAX every single year. So the net qualifying capacity derates that somewhat. In addition, we derate solar and wind with the effective load carrying capability. So what we're talking about are reserve margins on the net qualifying capacity basis, which is really what we think we can reliably count on, and that changes over time. The other thing we'd like to note is that what we're seeing is a decline in forward contracting, primarily through agreements. So in the early 2010s, the utilities served 85% of the load. They had large multi-year 10 and 15 and sometimes 20-year tolling arrangements. A lot of those tolling arrangements, in particular the 10-year tolling arrangements, are falling off. They're starting to fall off now, and they'll be falling off in the next several years, which means that there is a possibility for the exercise of market power if we move more to an RA-only capacity construct. So we note that those issues, as the system tightens, are going to be of a concern, at least to us, in both the energy and the capacity markets. We'd also note that peak capacity is a regulatory construct, which does not necessarily ensure that the electrons will flow. So what we want to note here is that you might have the capacity under contract, but unless that capacity is bid in and accepted, it doesn't necessarily flow. So you might think you have 45,000 megawatts, but if those entities are bidding at $1,000 and the price is only clearing at 300, we don't necessarily have those resources. In addition, if those resources aren't real, and they're bidding at 1,000 so that they don't get taken, that is a problem. That's one of the issues that we saw with some of the import contracts, and we tried to address it last year. It's also some of the issues that we might be seeing in the DR context as well. So what we want to make sure is that those resources are in fact not speculative in nature and potentially unreliable, but real and firm. In addition, we have a growing reliance on use-limited resources. So for example, we have renewables, solar and wind. Solar is available primarily during the day. Wind is available primarily during the night. Hydro is dependent on the water year. So you can have a good or a bad water year. And batteries, the batteries that we're bringing online are 4-hour batteries. So, and as all of those resources grow, that means that we're having, our reliance on resources that are not available 24/7 grows, and that does, it does become a challenge. And so, you know, a lot of people are talking about moving to an hourly capacity construct. Do we have enough capacity in each hour? And so we'd note that when you start to think about hourly capacity, in effect, what you're talking about is energy, right? Do you have the energy in each of those hours? So that's one of the reasons we want to talk a little bit about energy, not just capacity. Finally, we'd note that there is a growth in retail choice, and our concern is the relationship with the provider of last resort and the ability to plan for reliability. So if you think about it, what we have is many, many entities, and many of those entities don't know if they're going to be serving load in 1 year forward or 10 years forward. And so they might not want to invest in contracts or in resources 10 years forward. So that's an issue both for reliability and planning. And in addition, I'd note that there's a certain amount of load uncertainty. So if the IOUs aren't sure whether they're going to be serving 100% of the load or 50% of the load or 25% or less, it makes them less likely to want to make investments in long-term contracts or utility-owned generation, or in the case of CCAs or ESPs, owning the generation themselves. So that's the kind of, those are the kinds of issues that make it difficult to plan for the reliability of the system. Finally, we'd note that we're well aware that there are retirements that are occurring throughout the West. We'd note that the Navajo coal power plant, 2,200 megawatts, retired, I believe, in late 2019. And that may have been some of the issues that were occurring in the Southwest this past summer. We understand that other assets will be retiring throughout the West, and that California does rely on imports, and that does raise concerns. So if we have traditionally counted on 5,000 to 10,000 megawatts to come through California, that may change in the next decade. And so given that, we are concerned about reliability in the future. So these are just some of the problem statements and issues that we've identified and that we've talked about in the paper. And I'd just like to turn it over to Frank at this point to talk about his proposal and also Energy Division's proposal at this point in time. Thank you.
Not the best. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I'll try to make up some of the time. So what I think discuss this, as I said, this long-term resource adequacy proposal where, and so the real question here is why does, I think Michelle summarized very well why the long-term resource adequacy process needs to change. It's the ambitious renewable energy goals, it's the greenhouse gas reduction goals, And it's the fact that California is extremely import dependent, not necessarily a bad thing, just simply something that makes the existing capacity construct not make a lot of sense, simply because imports occur, not because a specific generator is committed to supply to California, but simply because more energy is produced outside the state and it's consumed outside the state in the Western interconnection, and therefore the opposite is true in California, so the power flows into California. And identifying that source is purely a financial construct. And so the point being is that the long-term resource adequacy mechanism that California adopts going forward to address the issues that it faces with the reliability need to really put these two issues front and center. And the other is that there's a lot of technologies out there, and I think President Bajer gave a good introduction in the sense that the demand side can really participate, and it can participate if there is a financial incentive for demand to participate in the form of we in California spent millions of dollars on interval meters. We have the opportunity to use dynamic retail pricing, automated distribution monitoring, and load shifting technologies. And the mechanism should support those kinds of business models to get the efficient deployment of that. So at least the point that I would like to make today at first is to say this new world makes a capacity-based mechanism an increasingly expensive approach to achieving long-term resource adequacy. First, because of this issue of defining the firm capacity of intermittent renewables is difficult, I think, if not impossible, as the experience of August 2020 demonstrated. And then the firm capacity of imports, for the reasons I just discussed, there really is no associated firm capacity. It's just energy coming over an intertie into California. And then the other is building in a capacity market typically is going to limit price volatility and other kinds of things that are likely to benefit dynamic pricing and load flexibility. So it seems that a standardized long-term energy contract approach could provide a lower cost to long-term resource adequacy mechanism for California, given its unique circumstances and how the trends for those circumstances, meaning that more intermittent resources being used to serve demand, and the fact that there is technological change in terms of the technologies that can build in load flexibility. So, the first point I want to make is what I've written down at the bottom of this is that this energy only versus capacity market dichotomy is really is a false dichotomy. All wholesale markets with a finite offer cap require a long-term resource adequacy mechanism. I just want to clarify that up front, that I definitely believe that's the case, and I'm now would like to explain why I believe that's the case. In that, in the former regime, you had a vertically integrated geographic monopoly. The PUC regulated that geographic monopoly. The PUC could penalize that geographic monopoly if there were supply shortfalls, because it was responsible for, generation, transmission, distribution, and retailing. So you had a single entity to blame if the lights did not stay on. In the current regime, we have a problem that everyone can point the finger to everyone else, in the sense that the ISO can only operate with what it's got. Generators can only supply energy from their own units. Retailers can only purchase energy that's available. And so, unless the regulator is willing to treat electricity like any other product, and I'll discuss on the next slide what I mean by that, then we're going to need a long-term resource adequacy mechanism. And the way we treat any other product is we typically say, we're going to let price clear the market under all possible future system conditions, meaning, whatever is necessary to make supply equal demand, that's the price that we're going to allow. Well, in the case of electricity, we have offer caps and we have price caps. And we also have, in many instances, no interval meters, so it's going to be difficult to charge customers prices that vary on an hourly basis because you can't measure the customer's consumption in an hour. And so what we have under this sort of scheme is still, even today, is that all customers know that if random curtailment will occur, if it turns out that we're inadequate. In other words, we're going to have to do rolling blackouts. We're not going to be able to essentially black out the customer or the retailer that failed to procure adequate amounts of energy in the forward market. This is sort of this is a circumstance where we simply have to do it randomly. And the fact that we're doing this randomly implies that no retailer or customer faces the full cost of their failure to procure sufficient energy in advance to meet their demand. And this is the classic, we could say, reliability externality, in the sense that what we have is I don't bear the full cost of activity of under contracting, therefore I under contract. Therefore, I have an incentive not to purchase as much energy as I know I will need to meet my demand. And so what we want a long-term resource adequacy mechanism to do is to correct this reliability externality that we have. And the typical approach that we have taken is this capacity-based approach. And the important point that I want to get across in this slide is the initial conditions is we have an electricity supply industry with primarily dispatchable thermal generation resources with little import dependence. We have mechanical meters, and the only thing that still is true is we have an offer cap on the short-term market. And our typical concern is sufficient installed capacity under these conditions to meet the system peak. Well, if we think in terms of the situation that we have now is dramatically different and getting even more so. And so we may want to think about that. And why is it dramatically different? Well, it's because in a world in which we have thermal generation, figuring out what the firm capacity of a generation unit is pretty straightforward and quite credible, in the sense that we would take the nameplate capacity, multiply it by the availability factor, and we've got a pretty good number on the firm capacity that unit can provide. With hydro, it gets a little bit more difficult. One example from some work that Sean and I have done in Colombia, the big problem is determining what that firm capacity is for a hydro units. Typically, it's based on worst possible hydrological conditions. For wind and solar resources, it's extremely difficult, and more important, even more so, getting increasingly difficult because of the fact that there is a high degree of contemporaneous correlation between the output of solar and wind resources across the state. This is discussed in detail in this paper that I've cited here, but there's, the simple way to think about it is no matter where you put the solar units in California, it's pretty much a good solar day in California or a bad solar day in California. And similarly, but to a lesser extent for wind. This creates some significant problems with defining what is the firm capacity of the intermittent resources. And just to put a fine point on it, the values used for the ELCC for August 2020 was 27% for the solar and 21% for wind, neither of which was happening during the period that the rolling blackouts occurred on August 14th to 15th, which suggests that this may not be the best way to address a reliability challenge. So this is just showing, just to put a finer point on it, this is the box is when the essentially curtailments occurred, and you can see that the renewable output was certainly significantly down, given, remember, net demand. And then similarly, here is the same for the 15th of August. So the other issue that's increasingly important to understand is this idea of a import. Is it's very unlikely that regulators in neighboring states are going to allow a unit that is owned by a utility under their jurisdiction to sell firm capacity to California of the amount necessary to meet California's import demand. But imports can, as we say, sell a fixed quantity of energy to be delivered. And the important point I want to emphasize for most of my presentation is what we mean by delivered in the case of energy is financially settled, and meaning financially settled against the price at a node in California. This at least provides price certainty to the retailer or loader for that fixed quantity of energy. And an important point that I think is, I call the harsh reality of electricity imports, is that in real time, imports go to the party willing to pay the highest price. Even if you have a commitment for suppliers out of state to offer their capacity or energy into California, another buyer can purchase that energy at or below the price cap in California and sell it outside the state at a higher price. And so that is just the harsh reality of electricity imports that needs to be taken into account, again, in the design of a long-term resource adequacy mechanism. So this is just showing what happened. This is day-ahead imports on the 14th, 15th, and then 6th, 17th to 18th. And the point I wanted to emphasize is just that we didn't get a lot of imports scheduled day ahead. We got a lot more in real time, but not a lot more in real time on the 14th and 15th, hence the need to curtail. Whereas for the 16th and 17th and 18th, even though there were similar situations, we managed to beat the bushes in California and find additional imports to keep the lights on. So what we need is as I said, if we have the financial commitment for generators to actually supply that energy, that will be less stressful. So just to finish up on the conclusion for capacity payments, for the reasons that I've just discussed, I think these are increasingly expensive mechanism to achieve long-term resource adequacy. It really doesn't address the primary reliability challenge that we're facing now, and increasingly so in California, which is energy shortfalls. There's definitely not a capacity shortfall in California. There are energy shortfalls that occur. And the other that we've certainly learned is that there's market-based pricing of capacity is challenging. Eastern markets provided a number of lessons on that. And then the other is there really is not a lot of empirical evidence that the markets with capacity payments have achieved higher levels of short or long-term reliability. So at least it seems to me is it's just time to change the paradigm. And as I said, just to reemphasize the point I made at the start, is that it's not a question of energy only market versus capacity market. It is the question that we need a long-term resource adequacy mechanism because we have a market with a finite offer cap. How do we best address that? And if we think in terms of what consumers want, they want the lights on 24/7. And I would almost argue for environmental reasons, they probably would likely prefer to have fewer megawatts of generation capacity in California rather than more megawatts of generation capacity. And so therefore, a big point here that I also would like to make is the fact that the resource adequacy mechanism should focus on meeting system demand, not necessarily the demand of any specific retailer, simply because this is an interconnected electricity network. And so what matters is that if one person or one entity is not adequate, but everyone else is adequate, the system is not adequate. So why not focus on the real problem, which is ensuring that essentially there is aggregate system demand is adequate. And that's essentially what the focus of this mechanism is focusing on ensuring that there's system adequacy in terms of the supply of energy being met, and then leave it up to market participants to figure out how to meet their specific energy supply and demand needs, but ensure it with the backdrop that everyone knows that system demand is covered. So as I said, what is the solution? Well, I think it's a solution that essentially ensures system demand is met all hours of the year. And California is able to meet its renewable energy goals, greenhouse gas emissions goals, as well as its integrated resource planning goals, and ensures long-term financial viability of all the resources necessary to meet these goals, and minimizes the cost to consumers subject to meeting these goals. And the way you're going to do that, as I write below in the important trade-off, is recognizing that anything that generators receive, consumers must pay. So in order for consumers to pay less, we have to, if you like, improve the efficiency of how the system is operated. We have to find a lower cost way for suppliers to meet the annual demand for energy and ancillary service. We want to put in an incentive for that to occur. And so what do I think is a way to do that? Well, it's essentially this standardized forward energy contracting approach, where essentially there is the hourly system demands throughout the year are purchased in advance at a fixed price. And therefore, all the sellers of these contracts now are, if you like, net buyers of energy. They've sold forward this energy. Now they have just the same incentive as the retailers. They want to make the cost of meeting their forward obligations as low as possible, because they've already sold. They've already at least monetized their revenue stream for the quantity of energy they sold of this contract. And the other is that if we have this mechanism in place, then all suppliers, it's common knowledge to all suppliers that all load in California is covered by this contract. So everyone knows that everyone has this commitment. There will therefore be all suppliers be, if you like, participating in a manner that is consistent with this knowledge. And as I said, the other way that we can do is it is consistent, as I'll explain, with meeting the state's greenhouse gas emissions goals and renewable energy goals. And we can also make it a comfort, if you like, bring additional comfort to the ISO and CPUC that this will actually be met by tying, if you like, what I will call annual firm energy magnitudes, and requiring suppliers that can only supply as much of this product as they have in this attribute. And we can also build in a backstop resource procurement by the CPUC if it does not believe that what is being sold is in fact physically feasible. And then finally, what we're after is fostering a liquid market for contracts between all market participants. So bilateral contracts at delivery horizons that really create a liquid forward market that can facilitate new entry of efficient generation. So the way it would work is that we've got essentially retailers are required essentially to hold, and I'll explain the distinction between hold and purchase, but they're required to hold these contracts at these percentages of their realized demand, of realized system demand. So they will hold shares of these contracts with delivery horizons of the form here. The point that I want to make is these percentages are not set in stone. They're mostly the security blanket, nor is the years in advance the contracts that have to be purchased. More years in advance, greater confidence, higher percentages of the years in advance, more confidence in resource adequacy. And the important thing, as I emphasize here, is these are shaped to the actual hourly system demand during the delivery period. And so one of the key components of this mechanism is that we are offloading risks of meeting system demand to the entities that are best able to manage that risk, which are owners of generation units, flexible demand, and rather than assigning it to an entity that has very little ability to address that. And as I said, this hourly contract quantity that is assigned of the standardized contract quantity, therefore, is going to vary with the realized value of hourly demand. And we'll talk about how this process works, and there will be the necessity, obviously, for what I'll call true-up auctions to account for the fact that you can't predict the future, but you can do a pretty darn good job, and therefore you need true-up auctions to make what I've just stated here be true. And then the other is we're not prohibiting any other contracting between market participants to manage their own specific supply risk or own specific demand risk. But what we have is ensuring that hourly system demand. So here's just a picture to illustrate how it would work with a 4-period example. Suppose we have period 1, period 2, period 3, period 4, and the total amount of demand for these 4 periods, as you can see, is 1,000. And so what it would work is if sellers, and suppose we have 3 firms that sell this standardized product. Firm 1 sells 300 megawatts of the standardized product, firm 2 sells 200, firm 3 sells 500. What this would then mean is that based upon these percentages of 1,000, each guy would be allocated the amount. So in period 1, demand is 100, total demand for the day is 1,000. So therefore, 300, 10% of that is 30, 20% is 60, and so forth. That would then be the sellers of that standardized product. That would be how their hourly obligation then is assigned to them for the delivery horizon based upon the realized pattern of demand during the delivery period. So an important thing about these contracts is that when the initial contract sold, we want to be able to offer those far enough in advance of delivery so that we can get the most competitive price for this product. How do we do that? Well, we do it far enough in advance so that new entrants can compete to supply this energy. And then the other advantage of this mechanism is that we can procure this thing through an extremely simple auction. We're basically simply buying a single homogeneous product, this so-called annual energy. And so we could use effectively what's called a declining price auction, where essentially you have multiple rounds. In each round of the auction, suppliers declare how much they're willing to sell of this product at this price, and we keep reducing the price each round until we get that the amount that they're willing to sell at this price is equal to or less than supply, and then we essentially clear the market at a price. Like the details of the case in which supply is less than demand, you take the previous period's willing to supply, this period's willing to supply, draw a straight line, and where that crosses the demand, that sets the price. And very simple auction mechanism that could be run. Okay, so the one advantage of this mechanism is there is no capacity requirement. We're going to let suppliers who are own generation units figure out jointly as a group, figure out the least cost way to meet system demand for energy and ancillary services for all of these periods. And as I said, this is focusing on the primary reliability problem in import-dependent market with significant intermittent renewables, which is adequate energy to serve demand. And I'll make, I believe, a non-controversial statement that says there's never been a shortage of generation capacity in California, or New Zealand, Colombia, Brazil, which are other markets with significant amounts of renewables. The big problem is always energy. So let's focus on having adequate energy to meet demand. The other is we can address this problem of imports by the fact that if everybody's covered by this standardized fixed price forward contract, in other words, all retailers are fully hedged for their energy purchases, by we can then raise the offer cap on the short-term market and essentially ensure that under stress conditions, California is going to be able to get all it needs in the short term of the energy it needs to keep the lights on. All right. So the way these auctions would work is they would be periodically run by, market operator. Could be the ISO, and the idea is that they would then be allocated the load. The way this would work is that depending upon how much load you're currently serving as a retailer, you would be responsible for your share of your current load in managing the counterparty risk associated with the fulfillment of these contracts. So in other words, there would be a clearinghouse that is essentially your counterparty as a retailer, and there would be the same clearinghouse that is managing the counterparty risk for the sellers of the contracts. And then as retailers lose or gain load, their counterparty risk obligation shifts to the entity that gains the load or loses the load. So in this way, we're not going to disadvantage retailers that lose load or advantage retailers that gain load any more than just simply the fact that they, potentially gained load. But you always have, what your resource adequacy allocation is and your counterparty risk for that resource adequacy allocation. It is your current percentage of system demand that's being served. And the way that it works is that, as we said, is that we allocate the contracts based on their share of monthly system load served. And so, as we said, I'll just show a picture. So suppose in my previous example, we have 4 retailers, and retailer 1 in that month sells 100, retailer 2 sells 200, and so forth. We then do the same thing of essentially retailer 2 then gets 10% of that energy of each hour's obligation allocated to it. That's why you see 10, 20, 40, 30. And retailer 2 is getting 20%. And in this way, we're allocating the counterparty to these contracts to each of the retailers during each month. And as the months change in terms of their share of system load, their quarterly, their hourly contract obligations will also change because they are serving more or less of a share of system load. All right, so as we said, what this builds in is both suppliers and load-serving entities know that aggregate system demand is fully hedged for all hours of the year. Now, you are likely, as a supplier or load-serving entity, to have outstanding price risk. In other words, if you like, the shape of your contract obligations, if you're a retailer or if you're a generator, may not match your actual production pattern or may not match your actual consumption pattern. You're free to enter into hedging arrangements to manage that residual short-term price risk. Now, one advantage is that because you know that in aggregate, all demand is fully hedged, there's unlikely to be, in aggregate, significant price dispersions from, if you like, relatively competitive levels in the short-term market. But, certain entities could bear greater brunts depending upon their load shape and may want to therefore engage in these bilateral hedging arrangements. Okay, so now on to how do we account for the fact that you can't forecast the future perfectly? Well, what you would do is after the fact, after the year is completed, there would be essentially, you would know all the information necessary to essentially do my pictures that I showed you before. And what you would have is effectively a true-up auction where you would the auction would buy or sell standardized contracts. So to the extent that over procurement within the year for the annual product that occurred, there would be a sale back of these excess contracts, and or to the extent that you didn't purchase enough, not something I would almost recommend buying a bit more than you think you need, simply because selling back then ensures that you will keep the lights on, even more than having a little bit of a shortfall. But the idea would be as follows. So suppose that we have an ex post purchase, meaning that actual demand was 10% higher. And I just drew it so it's 10% higher in every period to make it easier. And then I drew it so what this would mean is then it would give every one of these guys, I assume that their aggregate monthly, that their sales were similar. So each one of these guys got sold 10% more contracts in the true-up auction. And so therefore, this is their new hourly contract obligations for each of the firms. And then for the retailers, I did the same thing. Each of them, therefore, gets assigned 10% higher because all their loads were 10% higher. But it just makes things easier. But the math works out if that sort of scaling doesn't work. And then for an ex post, and then the important thing in this is then the price that we settle at is essentially the quantity weighted average of the purchase price of the original contracts plus the purchase price of the additional 10%. So in other words, even though we may have purchased that additional 10% at a very high price, we are putting it in as essentially annualized, so it's likely having a very small effect because it's literally 10% of the total that you might have purchased. And then similarly with the ex post sale, if we bought too much and then we would sell back 10% less, each of the three firms sells 10%, each of the four retailers actually gets allocated 10% less. In this case, you would have to then say, okay, we take the cash out. So we likely took a loss on the selling back of the excess amount of contracts, and then you blend that in and do again a weighted average of the two procurements, the initial procurement, and then the net loss from the sales or of the contracts that you did not use, and then that becomes the price that you would clear the contracts against. Okay, so just in terms of how the settlement works for specific retailers and generators, think of it as the retail price is the retail price, the contract price is that contract price I talked about, Q contract is the ultimate contract that they have. This is giving you their payment stream, and then P spot is just the actual hourly price associated with that hour, and this would be how the contracts would settle for retailers. And then for generators, this gives you how generators would sell. And an important point is, to the extent that retailers' contract position is close to their retail load, Q retail, essentially they're just earning the difference between the retail price and the contract price that they paid times their contract quantity each hour. And to the extent that a generator actually produces no energy, and this is an important consideration as we'll talk about, what they're earning each hour is the contract price minus the spot price times their contract quantity. So just bear that in mind as we move forward. Okay, so an important consideration of this mechanism is that there is no requirement that the seller of a contract must actually produce the electricity sold. And here is where what we're attempting to do with this mechanism is we're giving all of the suppliers of these contracts the strongest possible incentive to minimize the cost, their cost of serving the aggregate forward contract quantity, which so happens to equal the total system demand. And so what we do is as I discuss here, we put in a very strong incentive for suppliers to make the least cost for consumers make versus buy decision to meet their hourly standardized contract obligation. And I'll talk a bit more about what I mean by that. But and what this means in reality is that given that we have a lot of dispatchable thermal generation and we have a lot of intermittent renewables. Most of the time, the intermittent renewables will be producing electricity. And what this means, but then also most of the time, the thermal resource owners will be effectively getting this payment stream. They'll be getting the contract price minus the spot price of energy times their contract quantity as their revenue stream. In other words, they're not producing. But there's an important thing that they will be doing to ensure that this efficient make-buy decision occurs. And then the other is that this can encourage active demand-side participation because, as I said, we don't need low offer caps in the short-term markets. Consumers are in the aggregate protected. Consumers that are willing to manage wholesale price risk can essentially take on that price risk and essentially earn money from doing so. All right, so what do I mean by this efficient make versus buy decision? Well, if I'm a thermal
Frank, this is Jamie. I just want to give you a time check. We're at 15 minutes before this ends.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, so if we think about this efficient make-buy decision, if price is above marginal cost, what I would like to do is it's cheapest for me to supply the energy from my own unit. If price is below my marginal cost, it's cheaper for me to buy from the short-term market. Well, in a offer-based market, such as the California ISO, what does that mean? That means that I, as a supplier, would bid at least the quantity of energy equal to my forward contract obligation into the short-term market at my marginal cost to ensure that I make that efficient make-buy decision. And this should be true for all suppliers with forward contract obligations. The aggregate of all those suppliers is total aggregate of all the system demand of the contract quantities is system demand. So we've got system demand being bid in at marginal cost of the seller of that contract. So what, as I said, is this ensures that they are committed, because if you're not bidding in at your marginal cost, if you're sitting out, then what could happen? Well, if you're bidding it at a price above your marginal cost, you could not be taken, and the price goes above your marginal cost. You're buying at a higher price to meet your forward market obligation. You're losing money. So you want to keep your unit on, ready to go, bidding in every single day to ensure that if the price does go above your marginal cost, you're making the most money from your forward contract that you've sold. In other words, you're making that efficient make versus buy decision. And so the other issue is that what this is going to mean is has some implications for who sells the most of these standardized contracts. In particular, it will be very likely that it's the thermal resources selling the vast majority of these contracts, and the intermittent renewables providing energy when it is available from their unit, and the thermal resource essentially earning that difference between P contract and P spot. And so this is just as I said right here, but there's also other incentives that are built into this mechanism, which is to the extent that an intermittent resource sells this product, it is selling a product that its units are obviously not ideally suited to provide. So it is going to need to perhaps get a insurance policy against high prices during the periods in which its unit is probably not going to be able to supply energy. So for example, the intermittent resource might approach the thermal resource and say, hey, I would like to buy price spike insurance in the nighttime hours when my solar unit's not providing energy. What will you sell that for me for, thermal resource owner? Upfront payment goes from solar resource to thermal resource, providing fixed cost recovery to thermal resource. Thermal resource will want to be there in the middle of the night to ensure that it does not have to pay back the difference between the spot price and the strike price of that auction to the intermittent resource owner, and lights will again stay on at reasonable prices. So what this mechanism is, as I said, attempting to do, but if we want to ensure even more that we're getting this happening, we can prime the pump in the following way. We can say, all right, we're going to define this magnitude, call it annual firm energy. And in the case of a thermal resource, this could just simply be, this is essentially the amount of energy that we think this unit can produce under the worst possible system conditions for the year. And, we can determine this value under, using like the ELCC or other sorts of mechanisms. But what we then do is we could, in the case of, say, a thermal resource, it would be their firm capacity times the number of hours in the year. That would put a limit on how much annual firm energy they can sell. And for the case of intermittent renewable resources, I would expect, as I said, that would be a very realistic representation, a significantly smaller amount rather than, say, the annual capacity factor of that intermittent resource that they could sell, because of the fact that it would really literally be probably the 0th percentile of that annual average capacity factor that they could sell in this annual firm energy to ensure that the lights stay on. And so what this would do is then limit the amount of annual energy that each supplier could offer into the auction. So when the auction takes place, it would be bids by unit A, and the auction designer would just simply note that and ensure that you can't submit more to this annual auction than your annual firm energy quantity. And and what this is doing is ensuring that the energy sold can actually be delivered under all possible future system conditions. So in other words, it's a belts and suspenders. So the belt is the fact that we've got this construct that the engineers are comfortable with. The suspenders is the financial incentive that we've been talking about associated with the mechanism. So now what about new entrants, and how do they compete in these auctions? Well, the new entrants would sell this sort of product, and they would specify a certain amount of annual firm energy that they sell. And then they would have to make a showing to the ISO and CPUC that effectively says that at delivery date of this product, I will have a resource that can provide this annual firm energy. If not, then I will be cashed out in potentially one of these true-up auctions or other auctions in order to, because of the fact that I'm not there, and the CPUC can say, look, you're not meeting it. And we could even, and then again, the cost of the forward energy purchase to replace would again be allocated in the same manner that we talked about with respect to the true-up auctions that we discussed earlier. So the other is that, so how might this address California's integrated resource plan? So again, say after we ran this auction, we get to see what resources have sold in this auction. The CPUC can effectively look at those resources. It can make a decision as to whether or not it believes that additional resources are needed, and it can then make a procurement if it would like. And one of the interesting things that I think should be built into the mechanism is, to the extent that there is excess infeasible annual energy that must be can't be used because it's not feasible, all sellers have to refund that amount of energy in proportion to their contract sales, building in an incentive again for all suppliers to ensure the overall physical feasibility of the annual firm energy or the standardized energy sold. And giving the ability of CPUC to run its integrated resource plan. So what about renewable energy goals? With the renewable energy goals, if it's just unbundled RECs, then life is pretty simple. It's just, if I'm a retailer with 100 megawatt of demand, and it's a 40% RPS, I purchase 40 RECs. If there are bundled REC requirements, such as bucket 1, 2s, and 3s associated in the current program, then the only difference is I'm getting RECs bundled with energy. And what does this do? This just simply changes the retailer's net load to be now the difference between its actual hourly load and its bundled RECs that are produced during that hour. And the retailer still has its forward contract quantity obligation that we talked about earlier, and it may then want to now hedge that difference between what it thinks its bundled REC net load is and this pattern of essentially forward contract obligation. And this logic, I think, reinforces the need to assign a value that really is consistent with stressed system conditions, how much these resources can provide, not typical system conditions. And meaning significantly less than the values, think of it as if you like, the annual capacity factor associated with the firm energy would be significantly less than the 20-something% that was associated with August 2020. Okay, local energy requirements. So how do we manage this local requirements? Well, again, we want to leave that to suppliers to the greatest extent possible. Or alternatively, we can have, if you like, do this same product at several pricing hubs. So we could potentially say have a Northern California pricing hub, a Southern California pricing hub. That's probably, I believe, getting maybe overly complicated, but certainly could be done. But the important thing to bear in mind is that if suppliers are selling fixed price forward contracts that clear against a geographically average price, so suppose it's the California geographically average load price, then what they're going to have is a strong incentive to limit the difference between the price at their location and the geographically aggregated price. And so therefore, they're going to have a strong incentive to essentially sort out the least cost way to meet these local reliability constraints. But again, if the CPUC and ISO decide that, gee, we don't think this local resource constraint is being met with what's being sold, they can essentially procure something locally, do the refund process that I talked about for that amount of annual energy that it's replacing, and move forward. Okay, so the big issue here is, in order to meet these local energy requirements, the big issue is we need to do this far enough in advance so that there can be credible backstop to participate. In particular, it's a credible source of energy in the future. But the watchword here is, again, we want to, as much as possible, allow the suppliers to figure out how to keep the lights on in real time, and pay them in advance for doing and providing that service in the aggregate. All right, so finally, how might you transition to this long-term resource adequacy? Well, it's going to require a fairly lengthy, at a minimum 3 years, I would say, even longer on-ramp, in the sense that first you'd have to put it in place. But, the first round would be auctions that deliver 3 to 4 years in advance, and then each year you're rolling it forward and rolling back the existing mechanism until finally this mechanism ultimately takes place. Now, I just, in the remaining few minutes that I have, I wanted to at least talk about a bonus topic. So one of the things that we do at Stanford is we have a course that we teach in the Graduate School of Business that makes use of this game that we've developed, that effectively, the joke that I like to tell is, it has every aspect that a real electricity market has. It's just that the power doesn't flow. So we have suppliers with bid thermal resources, intermittent resources. We have retailers, generators. We have forward contracts. We have FDRs. We have two settlement markets. You name it. So what we did is we've done it with first a group of Western U.S. state regulators. We teach short courses using this game to regulators and staff of the members of the Brazilian regulator. And what we did is we said, let's do a comparison between a capacity market construct and an energy contracting market construct along the lines that I've just discussed with you. So the way the capacity market construct works is that players in the game first compete to sell firm capacity rather, equal to 100% of their peak demand in a uniform price auction, similar to how it works in actual capacity markets. And we give players a table of the firm capacity, fixed costs, variable costs for each possible technology they can build. Then after we run this capacity auction, players have to construct at least the amount of firm capacity they want in the capacity auction. Then the players also have to meet a 33% RPS and build the units necessary to do that. And then they compete to sell electricity in an offer-based short-term market, given the capacity they have, the renewables that they've built. And what we then have is the other game is players compete to sell long-term energy contracts that are tailored to the daily load shape, equal to 100% of, in this case, we do it with expected demand in the game just to make it easier for the players. And the players are given the same table of fixed costs, variable costs, and they're free to construct any mix of capacity they want. And they have to meet the 33%, and they compete to sell energy in an offer-based short-term market. So what happens, this is just showing that we have intermittent wind and solar, and consistent with how it goes in California, you can see that most of the wind is produced at night, all the solar comes during the day. And in the capacity market game, this is just an example of a bid screen where you submit as a player your willingness to sell capacity as a function of price. Players submit their willingness to sell capacity. This is just showing you what the various costs are. And then here is what the energy contracting game looks like. Again, you just submit your willingness to supply energy, knowing that the energy, quote, delivers according to these shares throughout the day. And what we then do is we play the game. And then at the end of both games, we computed the total amount of money that generators received in the capacity payment mechanism game. And we did the same thing in the energy market game. And in both cases, for the Western States regulator and for the Brazilian regulatory staff, we found that average wholesale market revenues per megawatt hour from the capacity mechanisms were massively, as you can see, higher than for the energy contracting approach. And this was largely because of these favorable incentives that the sale of these energy contracts create for the behavior of players in the short-term market. And we even found a slight reduction in the cost of serving demand under the energy contracting approach because of this other aspect that we talked about, is players have a strong incentive not only to behave competitively, but also to provide the lowest cost way to meet demand. So just to finish, I think as it said, it's hard to find any evidence where one would say there's an ideal capacity market that's performing well. The standardized contracting approach appears to me to achieve those goals for the type of market that we have in California. And we've even shown it with this game that it actually seems to work in practice. And so I'll just leave you with one of my favorite quotes from Niccolo Machiavelli about the difficulty of change.
Okay, Frank, we have a couple of questions that just came in. First, is the forward contracting, would it be capped at the existing bid cap?
What do you mean by, remember the forward contracting is a quantity, not a price. You can offer, it's a forward contract, and then the price at which the contract clears comes through this auction. I think the question is whether there would be a cap on the price then, Frank. No, there of course would not be a cap on the contract price that you could offer. I mean, you could certainly offer to supply annual energy to $1,000 a megawatt hour. I seriously doubt you would be taken in the auction. But no, no. But what I would think is that you would be effectively with I think the point, maybe the questioner might be asking is, could we raise the offer cap on the short-term market? I would certainly think that that would be a good idea to avoid what I called, early on in the talk, the problem with essentially imports, in the sense that imports go to the highest price in real time. And so having California's offer cap higher is certainly going to make that less likely.
Okay. And then do retail sellers have specific counterparty risk?
Well, they have this forward contract obligation that they have to fulfill. So in other words, to go back to my picture right here, this slide here, they're going to be clearing, if you like, against this equation right here, which in other words, or another way to think of it is, they're buying at the spot price, they're selling at the retail price, that's Q retailer. They're on the hook for this payment stream, depending upon if the spot price is above the contract price or below the contract price. That's their obligation to the clearinghouse that clears the forward contract. So they will face that residual risk, but they can, if you like, offload that risk through a bilateral contract that they may sell with another party. But the important thing I would try to emphasize as much as possible is that spot price that they're clearing their forward contracts against would likely not be nearly as volatile, for the reasons that we discussed, that suppliers have a strong incentive to get into the market and supply energy under all possible system conditions at the lowest possible cost to them.
Okay, this is Jamie. I'm going to just hop in. We're going to stop taking questions from the Q&A box and save the remaining questions that have been queued up for our Q&A discussion that'll start after we hear from our academic panel and party panel. So thank you, Frank, for the very, very informative presentation. Next, we will hear from our academic panel. Please welcome Jim Bushnell, a professor and co-director of the Davis Energy Economics Program at University of California, Davis, and Sean McRae, an assistant professor of economics at ITAM. And I'm going to hand it over to Jim first.
I'll go first. Okay, and I haven't timed this, so please feel free to cut me off when I hit my 10 minutes. I thought what I would do here is walk through, I guess, 4 parts. I was going to reiterate what I thought was an excellent list by Michelle, sort of give my own slant on the challenges or shortcomings of the current RA framework, talk about how this proposal Frank just presented, summarize my sort of take on it, which will include some questions as part of it, talk about the advantages, the degree and ways in which the proposal addresses some of these shortcomings on the list, and then segue into observations and questions about what the proposal implies and how it will work. Okay, so first, as far as shortcomings of the current RA framework goes, and this is not I'm sure there are others, but these are ones that I've sort of been focused on, and these are all sort of on Michelle's list as well. First and foremost, it's been increasingly difficult to match this peak hour capacity paradigm that really has been the design framework for the last 10 years to a market where there's a lot of energy limited and VERS energy. Hey, Frank, your keyboard is typing away, so if you could mute. So I think we need to somehow adapt this capacity framework, which I usually characterize as, if we can just meet that one worst hour of the year, then automatically all the other hours will be dealt with, because we would have enough quote unquote capacity to deal with the worst hour. Then of course we'll have enough capacity to deal with the other hours. But that logic falls apart when you have limited energy, and that's something that we've been struggling with for quite some time. I could see sort of there's two directions to go. One is kind of where the ISO has been talking about, which I would kind of super ELCC approach, or some way of trying to really take a really finely granular way of trying to measure the capabilities of all these units and apply them to every hour, versus what this approach, the spirit of this approach, is an energy approach, where we're kind of shifting the whole unit of the focus from capacity into energy. And I think it was Jamie that sort of made the point that, well, as you get to hourly and sub-hourly, at some point the distinction between capacity and energy goes away, because capacity is just about providing energy at a specific point in time. And if you have all points of time required, then it starts to look a lot like energy. And so one of the points I'd like to make is that any capacity counting design, ELCC or UCAP and all these other things, there are necessarily, and especially with energy limited, assumptions that need to be made, legitimate areas of disagreement. But I think I've seen this sort of get into a process where there's going to be different, groups that are advocating for their specific type of technology. There's going to be state leadership that favors certain types of technologies. And there's always this temptation to resolve assumptions in a way that kind of favors one technology or another, or if you're going to have to choose between two reasonable assumptions, maybe make it resolve that in favor of a specific type of technology that you really want to see succeed anyways. And it's really hard to, I think, remain completely objective when we go through a stakeholder process of trying to really kind of do all this counting. And I'll get back to this. I think one of the directions I'd really like to see capacity go, one way or the other, is to place much more of the burden of capabilities and assessments onto the suppliers themselves, rather than this sort of ex ante, okay, we're going to give you this much credit for it, but not really have significant penalties for non-performance. So problem number one, we've had this matching issue of capacity paradigm to an energy limited and VERS world. Second is that it's never been a mechanism that provides really a true hedge against high energy prices. It was never really meant to. And when we had the long-term procurement process with the PUC basically sort of oversaw a hedging process just through the forward procurement. And of course, as was mentioned, we now have a world with many more retail providers. And so there's questions. I don't know the answers, but there's questions about exactly how hedging works. We're going through a transition process with the PCIA that complicates answering those questions. I think there's an issue here about, do we need some kind of mandated hedging or not? And then lastly, the RA, as it's been implemented, the main product that we get is this must offer obligation from generation. And it's always been hard to really understand exactly what the value of the must offer obligation is. There are ways to get out of the must offer obligation, or outages are always treated sort of separately. And when you have energy limited, there are other sort of challenges to enforcing a must offer. And so they provide relatively weak and poorly targeted performance incentives, the current MOVE framework. And import RA, which has been discussed, is sort of perhaps one of the most egregious, but one example of how the MOVE is not a particularly strong incentive for converting capacity into energy when we really need it. All right, so those are my three kind of shortcomings that I was going to focus on: matching between capacity and energy, this hedging need, and the MOVE or something else in terms of performance obligation. When we think about the proposal Frank presented and how it addresses these, well, so first, my paraphrasing of this, maybe trying to distill it to its essence. It's a standardized load slice type energy contract. It would be a single statewide, Frank said it would be more complicated to do this at the DLAP level. I don't really see how that's that much more complicated. And I think there are real advantages to maybe, especially if we continue a retail structure that is more or less focused at the DLAP level, to do something at the DLAP level, for example. But I'm going to come back to that. I have questions about the local aspects. So to me, this is reminiscent of what we do with polar auctions in the Eastern United States, where there are default provider auctions. And those products are used for a very different purpose, though. So it's an interesting sort of application of a somewhat similar kind of, at least acquisition. On the supply side, it looks different, but it's interesting to sort of ponder how we're taking a mechanism like that and using it as a capacity construct or as a replacement for a capacity construct instead of dealing with some of this provider of last resort sort of questions. It's a single auction that would clear 100% of a forecast. I'm going to come back to what forecast we really think is appropriate here for, as I understand it, a year ahead, and there would be these declining percentages of the amount that needs to be covered as we go farther out into the future. It would be a single product for all 8760, sort of a slice of the 8760 system load. The cost would be allocated then ex post according to the actual load shares. I'm not exactly clear on how different load shapes would be accommodated that way if you had, for example, only peak load or only off-peak load, how exactly that allocation works. I think it's part of those graphs, but I haven't had time to penetrate them fully. And the sellers may or may not, it's sort of an option that's presented, be limited to something like their annual firm energy profile, I believe is the terminology Frank used, which could be thought of maybe as the new net QC or some kind of version of trying to evaluate in an objective engineering sense what the capabilities of physical assets would be. Now, this implies that the sellers of these contracts would be limited to physical generation resources only. That again is a departure from what we see in other types of load slice auctions, where a lot of the participants are marketers or even financial institutions that then go out and sort of bundle physical resources. The implications of that are, well, you'd have to trust the financial resources if you do that. On the other hand, you sort of get a lot more participation and potentially unleash some of the efficiencies of those types of groups on some of these secondary contracts that would have to be put together. So as I understand it, we're limiting this to physical. Am I down to 1 minute, 2 minutes? Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to move faster. The advantages of this approach. Like I said, I think one of the things that I would really like to see is to move the task or risk of evaluating the energy value of capacity or the capacity value of capacity onto the sellers of capacity. So to move it out of this kind of, we're going to have a meeting and objectively try to come up with formulas that assign how much capacity any resource is worth, and more force sellers to put their money where their mouth is. And if you think your battery really can provide what you say it can, when you say it can, then we'll put financial consequences on that promise. Now, this is not the only way to do that, but I do think it's a real appeal of this approach. Now, how strong that risk is, I'm still trying to kind of get my head around. Certainly, if you sell one of these contracts and you don't have supply during an hour where prices are $1,000 or $2,000, that's a pretty big financial risk. Spread out over 8760, we have to sort of think about exactly how strong that is. It ensures the LSEs are hedged for the vast majority of their energy exposure, and that would, I would argue, eliminate system market power to the extent these are generators that are on the sell side of these contracts. And it allows for the integration of potentially lower cost resources like imports, which we would like to take advantage of, while trying to deal with some of these legitimate concerns we have with the way imports are currently involved in the RA process, trying to sort of make sure it's not fictional resources by, again, putting financial obligations on those imports. All right, so now with that in mind, here are some observations and questions here. One high level comment is I think everybody I believe agrees that multi-year contracts are the lifeblood of certainly new generation investment, and even probably any investment that is required any significant investment required to keep generation operating. And so a question that always needs to be applied to any RA framework is to what extent these capacity solutions incentivize bilateral contracting or crowd out bilateral contracting. Are they complements to, or do they in a way replace? And to the extent they replace the incentive or reduce the incentive to otherwise do bilateral contracting, then they need to be strong enough and remunerative enough to actually support investment on their own, because they may actually be discouraging contracting outside of the RA framework. And I think that question applies here as well. I don't have my full head around it. There's certainly a lot of basis risk that would be remaining on both buyers and sellers here, so that leads to some contracting. But this is sort of we're going to buy energy, a lot of energy, all the time, and to what extent do market participants feel the need to do additional stuff around that? Who exactly is allowed to sell these contracts? I touched on that before. I think there are real trade-offs to limiting this to physical sellers. But if we're going to think of this as a substitute for physical capacity, maybe that's what needs to be done. But if we're just a physical seller, there's going to need to be a lot of additional contracting to help hedging all these remaining basis risks. My generator might be in the wrong place or might be generating at the wrong time in order to try to really effectively supply one of these types of standardized contracts. And so there'll need to be a ton of outside the market kind of bundling happening. And actually, financial power marketers are sort of the people who do that sort of thing now. Okay, so what is the appropriate forecast for this? If we're buying up to 100% of the forecast, are we talking about just the expected mean, the 1 and 2? What are the implications of going a little above? Usually, if I think of this as just an energy hedge, you would actually not want to buy 100% of your needs. You'd want to buy a little below that, and you'd be willing to expose yourself to some price risk on the remaining amount. So if we're thinking of this as a capacity instrument, what are the implications of buying 100% of your energy in a forward contract and not 98%? What are the implications from a reliability standpoint of buying only 100% of your expected and not maybe 100% of your 1 in 10 or something like that? This framework, I believe Frank touched on it, but I think it's absolutely true that this framework would need to be tied to a substantial increase in scarcity pricing, and I would argue also probably a transition of load-serving entities to nodal pricing away from DLAP pricing, because a lot of the investment and hedging outside of this standardized mechanism, I believe, would have to be incentivized by, again, higher spot prices and probably higher locational spot prices faced by certain LSEs and suppliers as well. So I view this as a way of trying to transition a market to a higher scarcity price while dealing with the market power and price risk concerns that such a transition might create. But I think doing it without raising the scarcity price would not really get us the investment reliability sort of benefits that it would raise. So that I'll end with the local issue. One of the issues we've debated over the last 10 years is the fact that load only pays a DLAP here. And so this, if we had a standardized DLAP hedge instrument, that's great for load, but it's not clear how well it meets the needs for capacity in certain, intra-zonal pockets. Frank's argument is that if you're a seller and you sell a standardized statewide average contract, you would have exposure to a local price spike to the degree that local price spike raises the statewide average price. And if I'm understanding his logic, that exposure, which I think is kind of diluted, would be sufficient for people to contract with local generators to mitigate the risk of that local price spike. But I do have concerns about that dilution effect. No one is directly exposed. Everybody's indirectly exposed through how it affects the average. And I haven't worked through the math, but I do worry that that dilution is going to be significant, and there wouldn't be enough sort of incentive to go out and contract with that local load pocket generator. Now, if the local price can spike to a significant degree, then maybe that does solve that. I think there are debates about exactly how much local LMPs are even a driver of local investment versus other types of contingency things that might not affect prices. I believe others might address that. Okay, so I'll end there. Jamie looks like she's ready to cut me off. So happy to participate in the discussions later, and thanks. Very interesting discussion.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. All right, Sean, love to hear feedback.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. So thanks to the organizers for the chance to talk today. Okay, so I want to sort of think back to the very first slide you might have seen if you took a course with Jim or Frank or me on Electricity Markets 101. And there's a slide that says, here are the things that make electricity special. The supply has to equal demand at every location, at every second. This is hard because demand is perfectly inelastic and electricity can't be stored. And because electricity has these special characteristics, everything else in terms of the market design is following from that, including the design of a capacity market. Now, as we all know, these assumptions are becoming less and less relevant, and California is really leading the way in that. And so given that these assumptions sort of no longer hold in a lot of places, we have to go back and revisit, some of the accepted wisdom we might have about designing electricity markets. And I sort of see this proposal for the standardized forward contracts as part of that process of rethinking how we do some of these things, given the changes in the electricity market technology that we see and we're going to continue to see moving forward. So we think about the problems with the existing capacity-based reliability mechanism. So this is something that Jim discussed. And so, I just add to this, the one concern we might have is that, the existing mechanism is just not the way of achieving the lowest cost supply of consumers with electricity. And, there's different inefficiencies in the mechanism that mean it's just not going to achieve its objectives at the low cost. And so if you'd asked me a few years ago, I might have said, well, that's really the problem with this mechanism. It's just expensive for consumers. But as we've heard several times this morning, there's a bigger problem is that, the current mechanism isn't even achieving its objectives. That's no longer providing incentives to all the parties to ensure a continual supply of electricity. And so this is a problem that's just going to get worse and worse over time with, sort of increasing extreme weather events and increasing reliance on renewables. And so we have a mechanism that's, probably more expensive than is required, but on top of that, it's not even, doing its job. And so, the proposal today is sort of, one way of potentially fixing many of those problems. So I want to touch on a couple of aspects of the proposal in terms of its effect on two types of generators, on thermal generators and intermittent or renewable generators. And so first thinking about this from the point of view of a thermal generator. So for them, the amount of energy that they sell through these annual energy contracts is going to be much larger than the amount that's actually generated during the year. And this is a difference that's going to increase over time as the share of renewables increases. And so, eventually, most of the revenue for the thermal generators is going to come from selling these contracts. And, this will be the case even if, they produce no electricity at all during the year. And, in terms of, the level of risk this is putting on thermal generators, this is probably increasing the risk for the thermal generators and the risks that they have to manage. And the reason for this is coming from, as Frank discussed, that these standardized forward contracts have the quantities matching the system load shape. And for any particular generator, that might not necessarily be a good match for their physical generation technology. And so the generators are going to have to engage in additional cross-hedging, ways to deal with this particular risk, sort of to match this load shape type contract that they have with their technology. And so we might say, well, this is kind of a flaw that we're sort of asking these generators to sort of take on more risk and manage this risk. So I'd say here, at a basic level, that there's some overall level of risk in the system that's exogenous, and this is going to be determined essentially by weather conditions in terms of extreme heat and demand, or drought in terms of hydro, or sort of low wind and solar availability. And this aggregate risk is always going to be there, and it's going to increase over time with more extreme weather events and more reliance on renewables. And so the question is, how do we allocate this aggregate risk? And so one approach, which is, well, the current approach is, sort of to have the regulator try and manage this risk and essentially push the residual risk onto the retailers and consumers. Or another way is just to take more of this risk and pass that on to generators. And so why would we want generators to take on more of this risk? That's because generators are basically the ones best able to deal with this risk. And in particular, we see development of more and more technology that makes it easier to manage this risk. If we think about storage technology, or different ways of doing demand response, and presumably over the next decades, there's going to be more and more things that we can't even imagine yet. And generators are really the best place to be, fast and innovative and take advantage of these technologies and look for new ways to manage this risk. Currently, the generators don't have much reason to do that, and these standardized forward contracts are going to give the generators this incentive to be innovative in managing this risk. So this is, more from the perspective of, say, the thermal generators. If we look at how this proposal looks from the perspective of the renewable generators, so for them, they have the opposite. So the amount of annual firm energy that the renewable generators can sell is basically has to be set at the absolute worst case. And so essentially the renewable is going to produce a lot more electricity than the energy that they've sold through these standardized contracts. And so essentially from the perspective of the renewables, they're going to be receiving less money from these reliability payments, potentially than they are now. And so, this is sort of taking away a revenue stream for the renewable generators. And so we might think, well, this is kind of a flaw. This looks like a bad deal for renewables. So on this, I think, we kind of have multiple objectives when we're running the electricity market, but two objectives that I mentioned is that we want to have a continuous supply of electricity, and we want to have a certain percentage of that electricity being supplied by renewables. And we have two mechanisms to meet these objectives. We have the reliability mechanism to ensure the reliability of supply. And then in terms of ensuring a particular percentage is coming from renewables, that is what the Renewable Portfolio Standard is doing. And so given that we have an RPS, we don't have to worry about not paying the renewables as well through whatever capacity mechanism we have, or perhaps through these standardized forward contracts. So in theory, the revenue for renewables should stay the same. And all that we're going to be doing is just reducing the share of revenue coming through the capacity mechanism and increasing the share that's coming through the renewable portfolio standards. And so this sort of change in the distribution of revenue for the renewables is probably going to better match the contribution of renewables to the system. And essentially the renewables aren't providing reliability, and so they shouldn't be receiving revenue associated with that. So finally, I just want to sort of come back to thinking about, sort of a distinction that often people make, which is, say, between a financial contract and, let's say, a physical contract. And so is there a difference between paying a firm to, have 100 megawatts available, or buying, this type of contract, 100 megawatt contract from the firm? And so one might look more like, this is a physical agreement, and one is more like a financial agreement. And perhaps we think, well, this electricity is so important, we need to have these physical agreements. We can't just rely on financial agreements. At the end of the day, the worth of any contract depends on how it is enforced. And there's really two ways to enforce contracts, and one is through physical force, which is usually not the way things work at least in US electricity markets, or the other way to enforce a contract is through the threat of financial penalties. And so it doesn't really matter what the contract says. The incentives for complying with the contract are almost always going to be financial incentives. And so as we heard right at the start, the problem with the current capacity payments is that there's little or no penalty for not being able to supply the electricity when it's required. And so there's different ways of tweaking the system to change that. But at the end of the day, the reason the firms are going to supply electricity in a given hour is going to be a financial incentive. And that's true no matter, exactly, what this contract looks like. And so the only difference with the standardized forward contracts is that the financial incentives are going to be much more transparent. Okay, I see Jamie there. So that was all I had to say. So I'm looking forward to hearing the comments from the other panelists.
Thank you, Sean. I was going to put 2 minutes up, but you wrapped it up early, and we're running a little behind here. I'm going to say we'll have a 5-minute break. I know we had initially planned to do a 15-minute break here, but to make up some time, we'll just do a quick bathroom break. So if parties can come back at let's see here, 10:50. Okay, so I guess 8 minutes or 6 minutes. So come back at 10:50, and then we'll start our party panel. And in the meantime, we'll bring the party panelists into the panelist section up here while we're on break.
Jamie, is it okay if I just sort of respond to a few of the things before they start the party panel? Or I promise to take no more than like 5 minutes, but it's up to you.
Yeah, we could do that, and then we'll take a 5-minute break once you respond, and then we'll jump into the party panel.
No. I meant before just before the party panel starts.
Oh, perfect. Yes, that would be fine.
Okay, thanks.
Great. All right, welcome back. So as discussed, we're going to let Frank respond to what the panelists had said in the last section of the workshop. And Frank, I'm going to ask you to kind of limit your response. Maybe we can get into some of the details in the discussion once we hear from parties.
No, the only reason I wanted to do that is just to clarify some things before, so that, that's all. So like the first is just to say we're actually, I agree it's somewhat confusing, but we're actually purchasing the actual system demand, not the forecast system demand. That's the purpose of the true-up auctions, and we're allocating. And then the other is, we're not saying that only generation resources can participate. For example, any resource that the ISO would be willing to assign a sort of firm annual firm energy value to, such as a battery or something like that, would certainly be perfectly reasonable to participate. And the other I thought was really good is, maybe this is on the borderline, but I think Jim's point about the multi-year contracts crowding out, being crowded out by the capacity payment. I would just note that in our games that I talked about, that's definitely what happens. Once the generators get the capacity payment, their interest in contracting goes immediately out the window. And then finally, I thanks a lot for Jim, though, for his comments. And then for Sean, I think that he sort of stopped too soon in making, I think, a first order really important point, which is the enforceability of contracts, in the sense that one of the things with the must offer obligation is, well, what should be the right penalty for not offering? And that's an impossible task. Whereas with respect to energy contract, if you don't show up, the penalty is immediate, built into the contract. It is, what is the cost to replace the energy that you're not supplying? And you avoid the whole problem of what's the right price. You're getting exactly the right cost. And the other is that you're you don't have to worry about this problem of ex post, I got to go and penalize you, and we have this problem of no, I really didn't mean it, and everything else. So it just makes that process and the enforceability of being there much more transparent, as Sean said. So I'll stop there, and just, those were my clarifying comments on what they said, and only to say thanks very much to both of them for their comments, which were great.
Great, thanks, Sean. Thanks, Frank. So we're first gonna start with our we have 4 panelists today from the parties, and we're first gonna start with Nick Pappas from Cal CCA, and then we'll just go through the list. If you could, Frank, I don't know if you could jump to the panelist slide for the party panelists, which is, yep. So we'll have Matt. Oh, I guess I have them out of order here. So we'll start with Eric Little, and then we'll have Matt Barmack, Nick Pappas, and Peter Grippis. And we haven't really dedicated a certain amount of time to each one of them. really kind of depends on their questions, but I'll come and jump in if I think you're going a little too long so that we could hear from other parties.
Thanks, Jamie. This is Eric Little from Southern California Edison. So Dr. Wallach and Dr. Bushnell and Dr. McRae, thank you very much. This was very helpful. I will start off by saying that Edison started down the road of trying to do an hourly energy construct before it turned its proposal to a slightly different mechanism. And that's because we like the concept, but got to a point where it made our heads explode. While the proposal you put forth gives some simplification to it, I think there are some areas that it deserves a little further digging into to understand how exactly it would work. And I'm going to start off with kind of the general concept of what resource adequacy has come to mean over the past 20 years of it being in place. And the phrase is just as simple as, if only the RA fleet shows up, can we reliably operate the grid? And that is where I start to run into some difficulty of the idea that the consequence for not showing up is buying energy out of the market, because the consequence for not showing up may be that there isn't energy in the market and that we have outages. And I think, Dr. Wallach, your paper pointed out that there's this externality of reliability. And the difficulty is that it's thrust upon everybody, but not paid for by anybody specifically. And so you have the problem that the desire to hedge is different among different entities. The amount of risk that they will want to take on is different among different entities. So based on that, I have a couple questions about this proposal to try to better understand and see what might need to be done to it, if anything, to make it work a bit better in that regard. So the first question that I have is that this idea of a standard fixed price contract, I want to understand that a little bit better. Is this effectively a take or pay, or is this a call option with a strike price? So basically what I'm asking is, if I bought a resource for 1,000 hours at $50, am I paying them $50,000 regardless of whether or not they operate, or am I paying them for the amount that they actually operate based upon what the prices in the market clear at? So those are the two different constructs that I think of in this kind of sort of fixed price environment, and I want to understand which path we're headed down.
Yeah, sure. No, it's a standard swap contract. It's just that the quantity it is fixed for a fixed quantity, and that fixed quantity is as described in the pictures. And the other is that, remember that we're eliminating the reliability externality by the fact that in the aggregate all load is covered, and that's sort of the whole mechanism, is that all load is covered. You're exactly right, though, that certain parties may be exposed to spot prices, but in the aggregate, system load has been bought in advance.
Okay, so thank you. That helps quite a bit. I guess the question that follows up to then, or leads up to, is this idea that after the fact, if I've bought too much, there's an opportunity for people to buy that back. If I've sold a $50 contract for 1,000 hours and I'm going to get $50,000, what incentive do I have to sell that back at anything less than what I already agreed to in the beginning?
Oh, I would expect you'd sell it back for something much less, right? So that you're basically buying it back. Remember, if let's take the example of you, the generator. If you sold me 1,000 and I only used 900, then the auction, you're going to sell back the or at least buy back the 100, and you'll probably be willing to buy it back at a very, very low price. That's true. And you'll pocket the difference between what you sold it for and what you bought it back for, and that gets blended in to the settlement price for the contract. Okay, so I give an example in the paper that describes that. So if it turned out that you used less, we sell that. We essentially run the auction for you to buy it back, and there'll be competition among the sellers of the contracts to buy it back, but I would expect, as you said, that competition would result in a much lower price than the price that it essentially sold at.
Okay, so I thought this was an ex post true-up. So we already know what was needed and what was used. And if I've already done the first contract for 1,000 hours at $50, and I'm going to get paid that $50,000 because you've said effectively this is a take or pay.
Correct.
When you go into that auction to buy it back, I'm not sure why I would accept a lesser price, because I know I'm going to get paid the 50K. And so I'm not sure why I go in and offer to sell it back at anything less than what I already agreed to.
No, you're not selling it back. You're buying it back as the generator. Remember, you as a generator sold the energy forward.
Right. And if I'm buying it
1,000, I only used 900. I need to buy that back from you. What would you sell that back for me for? Take the simplest example. You would say, you'd say, great, I'll give it back to you at 0, because you're right. I still get to keep the full 50,000.
Okay. All right. I'm
settling up an imbalance. But we would at least there's some competition in the sense that all the entities that sold, they would compete to essentially buy back that, and we might get a price above 0. But you're right. If it was, what will you pay me to essentially, take it back? You could say 0, and you get to keep the full amount.
Okay. So in that buyback, can they buy back more than the original quantity that they gave? So they're bidding for the aggregate. Is that why they have an incentive?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah,
right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So that kind of gets to the second point that I'm concerned about with this, and that is.
Well, why? Given that it's you already know what you got sufficient.
Oh yeah, no, not that point.
Oh, okay.
It's a different point. So. This seems to be predicated on the idea that this is going to be a centralized market where everything happens in one spot. And I think that California has expressed a concern on a number of occasions about having that type of a centralized market and it becoming FERC jurisdictional, and California losing some of its ability to dictate the roles of what renewable is going to play in the market, et cetera. And so I wonder if this mechanism then turns into a bilateral, and when it turns into a bilateral and you start disaggregating this, there's no longer a central clearing price. There is a pay as bid bilateral type of a mechanism, and I'm not sure you wind up with the same outcomes in that situation. So do you have any opinion on whether or not this is effective as a bilateral market, or whether it loses a lot of that appeal?
I don't think that the big reason that there's 2 reasons I like organizing it the way that I have. One is to make it completely neutral to retail competition, since California is, facing, at least with CCAs, losing and gaining load with CCAs and the like. And so having a mechanism that's just sort of transparent to the fact that load moves around is both amenable to CCAs and hopefully eventually with retail competition. The only difference, if you tried to do this through a bilateral, would be, I think you still want to have this standardized product. You could essentially say, here is the standardized product, all entities must buy, and then entities that lose load can sell what they got, and entities that gain load can buy. But that just would, to me, then you get winners and losers when load gets lost. But I don't think there's any, it's sort of fundamentally about who gets the rents. And the reason I like this is that it gives the ability to also manage the counterparty risk. Is the other advantage I see of this mechanism, is the fact that if there's a single entity that's seeing what everyone is doing, you can significantly reduce the counterparty risk associated with these contracts. Whereas, as I'm sure you well know, when Edison signs a contract, they certainly are going to have to post a lot less than someone else, and it's because of counterparty risk. And so, if what we can do is see everything, we can hopefully economize on the amount of capital that gets, if you like, sort of wasted in counterparty risk management. So those are the 2 advantages I see of a more centralized mechanism. But I would say, in the terms of the FERC concern that you have, I would only say that's kind of above my pay grade, since I'm not a lawyer. But I do agree it is a concern.
Okay. Dr. Wallach, thank you. Jamie, I'm going to hold on to other questions at this point to make sure that the other panelists get an opportunity.
Thanks a lot, Eric.
Okay, I just want to check in with Jim and Sean. I don't know if you guys had any response to Eric's questions that you wanted to weigh in on.
Oh, well, I'll just say I thought of this as a contract for difference, which I think is basically synonymous with a swap contract. But I confess, a contract for difference, the settlement would be at like the ISO day ahead price or something like that. And so I don't quite get how the ex post auction fits that dynamic, or why we even need an ex post auction.
Because you have to hit the quantity equal to realized system demand.
But why do you have to hit the quantity equal to realized system demand in this contracting market?
Because that's part of the scheme, at least for mine, at least, is that I want all parties to know that system demand is fully covered with contracts. But if you don't like that, that's fine. But that's the way that I've presented it.
Okay, I don't quite understand the idea of a contract that's ex post and what the advantages of after the fact reaching a contract.
Oh, well,
that's resource adequacy.
Well, part of the issue is I think Eric got right to it, in the sense that the reason I don't like the load shape contract that, say, is like the BGS auctions on the East, is that here you can actually buy more of this energy. If you're nervous, you can buy a little bit more than you think you're going to need, and you sell it back. And the only difference is that the settlement price against which you're going to clear the contracts gets, the P contract in my equation just gets a little bit higher, because the parties bought back what you didn't use. But you've got a bit more confidence that you're going to keep the lights on.
Okay, but I guess you could do that with the spot price as well. I mean, you could always buy more energy outside of this standardized contract, and I think that's the idea, right? That people are reaching agreements outside of this standardized contract because they're going to have to deal with the gaps the standardization doesn't fill.
Right. But remember, the goal is system demand will be met every hour of the year. And that's what I'm shooting for with the resource adequacy mechanism, is that you're going to be assured that system demand is met every single hour of the year. One way you could do it is, as I said, you buy a little more than you need, and then you sell back what you didn't use. And that's fine.
I'll let others chime in here.
But I mean, you don't have to. I'm just saying, if you're worried, you could do that. And that's, I think, an advantage of this approach.
Sean?
Yeah, just that. I mean, so the advantage of doing everything in aggregate like this is as Frank said, I mean, this is facilitating retail competition. So you're not worried about each individual, unless sort of trying to manage and forecast their demand and acquire and buy and sell these contracts in advance if they're worried about what their future customer base is going to look like. And so I think that's one of the main advantages of doing this in aggregate. Other than that, I think Frank's answer is fairly clear in terms of the questions.
Okay, well, let's move on to our second party panelist, Matt Barmack from Calpine. Matt.
Thanks.
Do we have you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, you sound great.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. And I already did this once, but I'm going to do it for the full audience. I got to rib Frank a little bit for using our Metcalf plant as his background. I think that's great. And this is
well, Matt, I'd like the lights to stay on near my house.
Okay, good. We'll try to do that. And this is probably like the third or fourth time that I've seen this proposal, and I really appreciated the presentation. And every time I see it, I learn something new. And I'm still not sure I completely understand it, as my comments will probably reflect. So Jamie, I have a pretty long list of points, but just feel free to cut me off. I wanted to, first, sort of offer some very high level reactions to the proposal, and then go into a few things that we as a generator might like about the proposal, and then I have a somewhat longer list of concerns about the proposal. So I've had a hard time grappling with this proposal, and I think one sort of framing that helps me understand it is this is really an energy only approach to resource adequacy with scarcity pricing, sort of similar to the ERCOT market design, but then it has this very complicated energy hedging scheme that's sort of layered on top of that. And I think some of the claims that were made earlier today about how this sort of approach might lead to lower cost solutions, I think really relate to the energy only aspect of the market design, which tends to lead to lower reserve margins and just less supply. But I think the flip side of that is it may also lead to lower reliability. And in California and in other jurisdictions, we've tended to choose to operate our systems with higher planning reserve margins and higher levels of reliability than say in ERCOT. But I have no problem with ERCOT. We have a large portfolio in Texas. I actually like the market design, even though some of my colleagues don't. I think it's important to acknowledge some of the reasons that the market design has been viable there. They're willing to tolerate very high spot energy prices. So if an event like August occurred in Texas, the prices would be at $9,000 instead of $1,500 or $2,000 or whatever they were. As I indicated, ERCOT operates with pretty low reserve margins, and part of the reason for that is there are a lot of large customers in Texas that can isolate themselves from reliability events with their own behind the meter generation. Like, I don't mean rooftop solar, I mean large refineries with their own generators. And so, I think if we're going to adopt something like the ERCOT market design, I think we need to ask ourselves whether that will actually be politically palatable here. And I would like for it to be. So I think one way that it becomes more politically palatable is with the types of energy hedging requirements that Frank has teed up. Because if load is essentially, almost completely insulated from the spot prices, it just faces it a little bit at the margin, then there's less concern with very high prints. But as maybe I'll get into, I think there may be easier ways of implementing energy hedging requirements than the ones in this proposal. And then, I also just want to tee up that, in response to many of the concerns that Michelle introduced at the beginning of today, there are probably more direct ways of addressing those concerns than completely redesigning our resource adequacy program. So we could, for example, we could keep more or less the current capacity construct, but introduce new energy hedging requirements. So some of the things that we might like about the WOLAC proposal, we like to sell more products forward, and I think arguably this proposal would allow us to sell sort of more of the value that we provide more forward. Although that's a little bit unclear, like we'd be selling arguably more energy, but the capacity product is kind of going away. So, but just as an aside on that point, we already sell energy forward very extensively. We, for example, we were more or less completely hedged going into last summer. So I think if the PUC is really concerned about energy hedging, both how it impacts generator incentives, but also on the load side, the PUC may want to look into sort of the full spectrum of hedging that already takes place that may not be that transparent from RA compliance filings or IRP filings, because I think there is a lot that's already going on. I also agree with Jim that we like high-powered incentives for suppliers, and in this sort of scheme, if the scarcity pricing is real, and the prices in tight periods are multiple thousands of dollars per megawatt hour, that is a very strong incentive to perform. So we like that approach. There are other approaches, sort of under a capacity construct rather than an energy construct, to provide similar incentives, like the pay for performance in New England or capacity performance in PJM. Provide sort of similar incentives. So those are a few of the things that we like about the proposal. Some of the concerns that we have about, yeah.
This is Michelle. Can I ask you a quick question before you talk about the things that you don't like?
Yeah.
You just said that you were fully. Do you mean as an LSC or as a generator?
As a supplier, we were very fully hedged.
Okay, so you had sold your power forward. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
So scarcity pricing would actually have no effect on you then, right?
Well, no. I mean, it still would have provided an incentive, to make sure that our plants were available and operating. Yes.
Okay, so you're saying if you failed, then you might have had to pay the scarcity price.
Yes.
Exactly.
Thanks.
Yep. So I'll just try to go quickly, or Jamie, you can tell me to stop. But a few of the concerns that we have, have already been raised. But probably the one most significant concern is, this proposal is really a weird hybrid of physical and a physical and a financial approach to resource adequacy. I think I understand the way the scheme could work if it was really just kind of marketers providing this system load shaped product. But there's some effort to sort of to make this product resource specific, or limit the amount of the product that can be provided to this firm energy concept. And I think that's a relatively weak part of the proposal, and I'm not convinced that it actually leads to a portfolio of supply that is actually physically assures reliability or that's operable. And so I'm not sure what the value add there really is, and maybe it makes more sense just to keep the supply of this product, purely financial. And then, as Sean pointed out, this scheme shifts all kinds of risks to thermal generators, and he enumerated some of them, but my list includes the fuel price risk associated with making fixed price forward energy commitments. You're taking on a shape risk. You don't know what the shape of the system load is going to be. You don't actually know what volume you're committing to, because you're just committing to provide a percentage of the system load shape. And then, as Jim pointed out, there's also basis risk. Because you're ultimately exposed to sort of the spot price at a location that's not the same as the location of your resource. And I think Sean may be right that all of these risks are ultimately manageable. It's not clear that a generator is necessarily best placed to manage these risks. I think maybe a marketer or a generator with a portfolio could manage many of these risks, but I'm not sure an individual generator is really well placed to manage a lot of these risks.
Hey, Matt, I'm going to jump in and cut you off. Why don't we give, the academic panel a chance to kind of respond to some of your questions or concerns, and then we'll have to move on to the other party panelists. So I just want to make sure we have enough time for a response here.
Great.
So I'll respond. So, I mean, I sort of, I mean, I view, I don't view this as sort of the ERCOT market, because this does have a regulatory mandate for long-term resource adequacy. ERCOT does not. ERCOT does have people who don't contract up fully, and every now and then retailers go bankrupt as a result. So the other is that in terms of high prices and the potential to raise the offer cap, I think that that's something that you're going to have to do in a capacity construct, in an energy construct, because of what I said early on in my presentation. And I will say it again, just because I want to make sure everybody gets it. But it's the fact that as I said, it's the sad truth about electricity imports is that when the prices are highest, the energy goes where the price is highest, and that's regardless of a capacity payment, as we learned in August of 2020. That's regardless of an energy contract, and so. And that's the other difference between ERCOT and California is, which is sort of surprising, in that if ERCOT's willing to get by with smaller planning reserve margins in California, that seems like, to me, just the opposite. We have the ability to depend on imports, and the only thing that limits the amount of imports that we get is the willingness to pay in real time. By having these contracts, we're giving people the strongest possible incentive to be there in real time. So that's point number one. The other is I'm fine with, if you want to get rid of tying what you can offer into the auction to the capacity of the unit, that's fine with me. That was, as I said, mostly, but I think that actually does provide would provide an important input to the integrated resource plan, similar to the capacity process that currently occurs. In both cases, you have no idea if what you've got is really, or not no idea, but a limited idea if what you got will be able to serve demand. It's really all about the incentives to serve demand. The other, I guess I would say, is generators managing risk. I kind of thought that's what they were getting paid for. And so, I mean, that's part of the issue with the auction, is that you're going to set the price at which you would be willing to sell a product that embodies these services. And just a minor point of, remember, the important thing is the aggregate volume of the contract you sell is fixed. It's just when you're delivering that volume you're right, it is different. And so, and I think that's an important distinction, because I agree that if it's unlimited volume that you are subject to, I think that is a risk that more likely should be placed on partially on consumers.
Hey, Frank, this is Michelle. I know you're saying that even in the capacity construct, you need to raise the price because of scarcity pricing. But if that's the case,
No, it's not scarcity pricing. It has nothing to do with scarcity pricing.
Okay, so you raise the
with the fact that power goes to where
Okay.
the price is highest. And it's
So
not California if we have a price cap of 100 and the price outside of California is 500. That's
Okay, then what is the purpose of making a capacity payment if energy is highest?
You tell me, and we'll both be informed. Because I agree with you. I think that's the problem with the capacity construct in a import dependent market, is that, you know, people can, as we know, buy out the energy that you offered into California at a lower price and sell it outside the state. And unless you curtail exports, which I don't think you want to do, since it violates the integrity of your market and will certainly make importers less likely to want to import to your market, that's a problem.
Do we want to, did Sean or Jim have any response for Matt?
Yeah, so just in terms of the comment about, you know, a lot of energy hedging already taking place, I mean, I'm not sure about how far in advance these contracts are being signed, but, you know, part of the idea of this proposal is to have these contracts being signed, you know, sort of 4 years in advance potentially, and that's to be determined, but at long enough horizons that you can potentially have competition from new entrants. And again, this, you know, helps with you know, sort of keeping prices low. And in terms of the comment about all the risks for thermal generators, I mean, it's interesting to think about those risks. And as Frank says, you know, the generators are sort of sophisticated and able to deal with those risks. And to the extent that the markets don't exist to hedge those risks now, you know, we might think that new markets will develop. I sort of had the same, you know, initial reaction that Matt did, that, you know, perhaps the generators best able to handle these risks would be the sort of the larger generators of the whole portfolio. And so we may need to think about, you know, for the, you know, the small generators who are perhaps somewhat less sophisticated, you know, how this will work for them.
That's where those power marketers come in. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think the question is whether they are coming in via the auction itself, or it seems like your vision is that they're sort of behind the scenes of the auction, allowing the different physical resources to offer into this auction with more confidence in some way.
I'm indifferent to either way. It's just that I felt that the engineers would have, and the PUC would have more visibility to the extent that you're doing it this way, and then however you manage that individual risk is your business.
I suspect you're right there. I mean, there's two elements of that. You know, one is making sure that suppliers aren't selling more than they're physically able to do, and that's kind of the import problem in a sense, or that's the worry about imports, at least. But the other is that is making sure that the supply that is being offered is actually sufficient to meet needs in the right places and so forth. And I do think that's.
No, your point about I mean, you understood the basis risk argument and in your discussion, and I think that is, but that's where I think that again the backstop comes in, and the fact that there is the potential for this large basis risk that you face of all the suppliers if there are these local price spikes because of that. So yeah, I agree.
I guess in response to Matt, or I just want to sort of bring back to the crowding out problem. You mentioned, Frank, that capacity payments crowd out other types of contracts, but I do wonder to the extent this market would crowd out other types of contracts, and if so, whether a sequence of 1 year load slices is sufficient, and what and if it isn't, then where that leaves
Oh, no. I mean, I think the one thing that hasn't been discussed, and I'll put it aside to say, is what is the commitment of these contracts? Like, I could imagine that you sell annual energy. You could make the contracts, say maybe the 4-year contracts, you could make them have 4 years out with 3 years duration. Or we haven't talked about the duration of the contracts, but that's another design parameter that you can put in place to up the revenue stream if you want to make it attractive to new entrants.
Well, okay, but it sounds like you're taking the side of you want this to be the contract market then. And so we're going to make it remunerative enough. And the more attractive you make it, though, the less other contracts there are, I think.
I readily agree with that. But the point is that this is a contract that is serving a very, very specific goal, which is it is ensuring that system demand in every hour of the year is fully hedged system demand, but it's doing nothing for your individual load shape and your individual production shape as a generator. And that is the market that I think we would like to, that I would think would develop as a result of this. But yes, it will certainly crowd out the, sort of contracts that are of the form of, a load-shaped contract. If somebody's buying a load-shaped contract, that's what this product is. But it is now being sold through a uniform auction, transparent to all market participants. So I would agree. That is the hope that it will be the most competitive market for that product.
Okay, we are going to move on to Nick Pappas from Cal CCA. Welcome, Nick. I'm going to give you the floor.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jamie, and thanks, Professor Wolak, for bringing this forward. I really appreciate being on a panel with much greater minds than mine working on this problem. I think the reliable decarbonization market design problem is the problem for the decade for all of us in this industry. So thank you all for the level of effort and thought you've been putting into this. So I think there's been a lot of great discussion today around the mechanics of this proposal, the economics of the proposal, and I would associate a lot of my questions and comments with those that have already been made. And I think it's been very educational to hear some of this discussion. I think, like Matt, I feel like I'm continuously learning about this as we go through. And I feel like today I'm currently at my current apex of knowledge, but hopefully that'll continue to grow. What I think we need to focus a little bit on today, I think it would be a disservice not to raise some of the other elements, the sort of non-mechanics and non-economics, and talk about, how does this proposal potentially fit and integrate into all of the other policy structures we currently have. I think a lot of the discussion today has focused around, what would we do if we were designing an electricity reliability program for a jurisdiction that isn't going to start serving load or transition to retail choice for 5 years, is not in the middle of a reliability crunch, and is sort of very much from the ground up. And I think there are a litany of sort of policy structures, political realities, legal constraints that haven't had as much focus today. So I'll try to keep my questions short, but I'm going to try and focus on some of those areas, if that works. So the first question, and Eric raised this earlier, but this question of, does this work not as a centralized market or a centralized entity exercise or operating this market, but as an LSE specific requirement? And I ask that because we have some pretty fundamental sort of political and policy constraints that I think would push us in that direction. The first is the FERC jurisdictional issue. I don't think it needs to be repeated here. I think we all recognize that's a pretty significant policy concern and risk that is likely to be triggered if we have a centralized entity executing this. Reference to the Energy Division paper describing some of those concerns. And then I think the second issue is that we have, I think, pretty clear statutory preference to retain procurement autonomy with LSEs. Certainly that's another issue that I think would have to be thought through and resolved. If it's not in conflict, it's certainly in very strong contention with a proposal like this, with pretty substantial transition of procurement to the central entity of, frankly, I would say the majority of resources currently procured by an LSE. So I think with that in mind, I want to come back to Eric's question, is not, would you prefer this to be a central market or an LSE specifically operated policy, which frankly, I'm struggling even to kind of understand how LSEs individually would sort of do this. If it has to be LSE specific, do you lose a lot of the benefits of centralization, like efficiency, ensuring the incentive for new build exists and is sort of fairly allocated across LSEs, addressing the load migration risk? I mean, does this work if we have the FERC jurisdictional constraint, the state legal constraints that prevent this from being a centralized market? Maybe I'll pause there as question one.
Yeah, as I said, I don't really think so. I mean, I think the only thing is you've just made your life orders of magnitude more complicated in terms of compliance, and the CPUC's job of sort of making sure that they're adequate. But what you could do is literally specify, here is the sorts of products that you need to, here is the product that you need to hold, similar to like buying capacity under the current scheme. This is the product that you need to show us that you have sufficient to this. If you don't, then, then there will be a compliance penalty. And then you have all retailers that are submitting these things. And then, yes, there would be potentially a secondary market where people could trade these products among themselves. The big problem is, like I said, is just the compliance, the monitoring, all the counterparty risk management all get way more expensive, but that's about it. But it's the same thing that we have right now with the capacity construct being at the individual firm level, is that everything is being done bilaterally rather than in a standardized manner, which is likely to be far more expensive, at least in terms of compliance with meeting the various mechanisms. Because after all, as I said early on in the presentation, what matters is system adequacy, not your adequacy, because if you're adequate and everybody else isn't, or even if one person's not adequate, the system's not adequate and you're going to get curtailed.
Thanks. I think that's helpful, and I think this kind of orders of magnitude of complexity issue is one that, from the LSE perspective, I think is anxiety-inducing to some degree. Probably not to some degree, to a large degree. And I wanted to ask, sort of as a follow-up to that, do you think the incentive for new build still comes through if this is in a bilateral market? Are we still in the same position we are today, where arguably the incentive for new build is kind of lumpy across LSEs? It's not clearly sort of formed in a central market. It's not clearly sort of fairly allocated across LSEs. Do you see that being an issue if this is bilateral? Like I said, it just makes it more complicated. Just like right now, it makes it more complicated under the existing capacity mechanism. Is that one of the advantages is, I'm a new build, I sell this product, every load is getting a fraction of this product that I sold, that then finances the resource that I'm going to build. In a bilateral world, I've got to find all those counterparties, just like right now, if I want to do a new build in California, I got to find all those counterparties for the same thing. It just it's the same. It's the same under both. Is what I say. I'd say it's probably simpler under the bilateral energy construct, because what you're saying is, look, this is the product. And you just need to hold this product and find someone who will sell you this product. Okay, that's helpful, and I appreciate the follow-up on that. I mean, I think from our perspective, just to be clear, it's not that I think this is necessarily a proposal that's improved by going from centralized to bilateral. I just think that's a very real constraint we have to think about if this were to actually be implemented. It may be forced to be a bilateral. I think we need to think about the sort of associated complexity and efficiency losses, et cetera, that would accompany that.
So, Nick,
I guess what I would say is, I think there are ways that if working with a good lawyer to essentially minimize those distortions myself, but that's something not for today. But it's certainly something I've thought about, is, okay, how do I stay within the bilateral construct and still preserve what I think is a lot of benefits of this mechanism. And I think there are ways to do it.
So Nick, I if I could jump in here, Jamie, sorry. I was channeling what I expected some of your concerns to be when I was thinking about crowding out as well, because I would imagine, you know, how does a standardized financial requirement, energy purchase, coexist with different CCA's desires to procure specific types of resources in specific types of places? And I guess you could make it a bilateral requirement, but also you could think of it as, and I don't fully understand how well this would work, but LSEs go procure the types of resources they value, and then they set them back into this standardized framework.
I mean, this is one way you know, it's like, it's analogous to my example. If you can see my slides in the bucket one, you know, that you're basically just changing your net load by the fact that you procured, say, this specific resource that delivers energy in specific hours, and so it would be, you know, completely flexible to that. It's just changing your net load, and so you have a different difference between your net load and your forward contract position that you're now going to need to address.
Well, thank you both for that. I think maybe in the interest of time, if I can take one more follow-up area, Jamie, if I cut me off if I'm going too long. But I think the second element to this is, you know, we are in the midst of making a tremendous amount of changes to evolve the CAISO's operational markets, the IRP program around new builds for the procurement track, other elements of RAs that I think are attempting to hit on similar types of issues that this proposal tries to hit on, which is, you know, better counting, perhaps hourly counting and energy counting, bidding strategies and market power mitigation. You know, there's a lot of other elements in play. And I'm curious if I'm alone here, but I see this as largely displacing things like an IRP procurement track. My sense in this proposal is, rather than having LSEs go out and build new resources, the idea is that this entity is financing new build, and that's sort of, we're sort of deferring to the market to trust the suppliers that they believe what they submit to us and how much they think they can provide, and, you know, all hours and all levels of stochastic uncertainty that we have in this kind of new future is less than our demand, and then we'll have this price signal to build new. So we're kind of displacing the IRP procurement track. It seems like we're sort of building a kind of year ahead market into CAISO that's maybe, okay, I see you shaking your head. So maybe that.
No. That's the whole purpose, that it's 4 years in advance. You're buying in advance what you know you're going to need. So it is very much forward looking. It's a forward contract. It's just that during the delivery horizon, the amount of contract is 100%. 1 year in advance, it's a little bit less than 100%. 2 years in advance, a little less, but you can make that, you could make it even higher in advance to make sure that you're getting adequate new build to meet demand. That's if you like, the regulators, you know, if you like, control dials is the contracting percentage in advance that people have to hold to achieve what you believe to be the resource adequate. So that's key. But I mean, that's what we're trying to do.
Well, maybe just more broadly, the point is it's going to have to integrate, layer into the existing CAISO markets. There's certainly some interplay there. Seems to potentially displace the local RACPE that's just been developed. And I think there's a lot of questions I have about whether nodal pricing really gets at what local RA is trying to do, which, to, you know, really simplify is like insurance for a local transmission outage, which I don't think would probably be captured in the pricing here. So I think there's all these other pieces. And I think to disentangle all of those and rebuild them into this feels like a multi-year project. And so I think one of the concerns I have is that the sort of thing we want to begin undertaking in what is now, as President Thatcher said, we're going into year 2 of our very real reliability crunch and leaning in potentially into the 2020s into sort of more reliability anxiety. From a sort of timing and practical standpoint, I think we need to just weigh, does it make sense for us to try to rebuild each of those all together in this sort of large holistic manner with a proposal that I think is feeling somewhat kind of experimental and theoretical, at least to me. So I'm curious if you see it as similarly a kind of rebuild of all those other policies or displacement of, or sort of an overlay on top of.
Yeah, I guess I would view it as this would be completely transparent to the ISO. It would literally have no effect on how the ISO operates. It would probably be much easier for the ISO to operate the market, as consistent with the example I gave from the games that we played, is that because people are making and offering in a manner that makes that efficient make versus buy decision on meeting their forward contract commitment. So it'll be more of the quiet life for the ISO. They won't need to scramble as much. They won't need to worry, at least I would think, as much about generators being there, because as Matt said, you're going to get high-powered incentives to be there if you're not there. And in terms of the IRP, I think, again, you can, after you've run the auction, if the CPUC is not happy with what they've got in terms of the resources, they can go out and procure. The hope is that that's not the case. I view as the going out to have the, I'll give my bias, but my view is that to the extent that we are going outside of the market, we're doing something that's very likely to be more expensive for consumers than if what we did is let the market participants figure out the least cost way to do it. And so that was the point that I talked about with the if the IRP process goes out, buys an additional resource, say locally or system-wide, there will be a refund of the amount of annual firm energy that those guys have sold, so that all parties have a strong incentive to not let that happen. And that's the basic idea, is that I guess I view it as if we're going outside to purchase and order, say, the LSEs to make procurements, we've in some sense the market has failed. And the idea is to not build in mechanisms so the market doesn't fail.
Thanks. That's helpful. I think I'll leave it there. Sorry to be the naysayer of practicality, but appreciate at least introducing some of the discussion here around how we could potentially integrate. No, sorry if I gave that impression. I think your questions are extremely relevant and appreciate them. So thanks. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I agree. Thanks for the great questions. Okay, so let's move on to Peter Griffiths from PG&E. And I do apologize, we are running a little late. We'll probably end this section at around 12 and then jump into Q&A from the attendees.
Oh.
Peter, are you with us?
Sorry about that. I have been
okay, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. The questions I have are going to probably echo those of things that we've already heard in terms of some of the concerns and some of the questions. One of the things that that when I look at this proposal, and this is probably the second or third or fourth time I've been through it like Matt, and I am still learning things about sort of what it is and how it works. I want to just get some clarity on some things, in that there really is the need for a forward determination of sort of what resources can do and how they can, and how much energy they can provide. That is also a part of this, isn't it, Frank?
As I said, it can be. If you're Jim Bushnell, you maybe don't think so. You just say, look, I sold it forward, I'll figure it out. But what I'm saying is that's where the sort of feasibility can come in terms of you make a pre-qualification for this auction as to how much of this product you can sell. That's where the ISO and CPUC can come in and make those qualifications.
Yeah, and I guess I see that probably as an important part of because what resource adequacy is really trying to do is to make sure that you've got the physical capacity to be able to meet the load when needed. And I certainly think there's a role for financial incentives to do that. The question to some degree that I have about that though is, you've got to have some sort of a check on it, and because you have to have some sort of an authority that is going to tell you that yes, this megawatt size plant can produce the amount of energy that you say it can. Because if you're just taking the word of the seller, the question to some degree is whether the contracting and the financial incentive is going to be enough for actual performance. So the other aspects of that to some degree is sort of, talking about central entities is that you need to have somebody who's going to be able to set this up and to operate this and to fundamentally run this program. And it has to be, I think, what you're trying to do with this is to have a central entity to organize the way this system-wide hedging is working. And if I look at sort of what the practicality is of some of the things that may need to be done, that there's only a handful of entities who might be able to, or actually one or two entities who might be able to do this on a system-wide type of basis, or an institution to be able to do this. And so from Nick's perspective, do you think this is something that they say the PUC could do and set up and operate on its own, or is it going to need to assign it to, say, an LSE, or is it something that we think the ISO should do? And I guess Frank, I think you've expressed that you think the ISO should be doing this, but just from a practical perspective, is this feasible without having, say, the ISO do it?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think it is. I mean, I don't want to be necessarily, I mean, I guess the way that I would argue it would be as follows is the heavy lifting would be already what you're doing as a part of the capacity construct, meaning validating what people can sell. That currently still would remain a CPUC ISO validation of the sale of this product. And then, running the auction and doing compliance, that is basically, I could do both of those things myself. I mean, that's something that I think the PUC could easily do on those. And so, in fact, I think that the ISO could be sort of completely out of it if really.
Okay,
but clearly, sorry, but that's a big advantage of this centralized approach. That was in some sense why I settled on it that way, just because it makes life very easy.
Well, it makes life very easy for some parties, and it gives opportunities to other parties. I tend to agree that this provides a real opportunity, essentially, for marketers to be able to put together resources that they think can be able to meet the standard contract. But again, there is then the question of who's going to validate the resources that have been put together, and on what time frame does that need to be done. I mean, because I would hate to sort of have it be a case where you would be relying on a marketer to essentially to be able to perform, and essentially not have the ability to actually perform, because that puts the ISO in a very bad place. And if we're relying only on resources to meet demand that are RA resources, which I think certainly has been perhaps an objective, it's not clear that there would be much of an incentive for very many other types of resources to be around that were not participating or providing power through this type of contracting mechanism. So I guess, and that brings up sort of another concern that I have is, the way you've described it, Frank, is that there's always some sort of a thermal generator in the background that has ability to create energy from fuel. And I see very much where the resource mix going in California, which is to be relying a lot more on storage resources. And it's not at all clear that you have the same assurance from storage resources that they can provide and deliver energy when needed, or as they may have projected. And so that's why, to some degree, there are concerns that I have about sort of who's determining what resources can count and how much they can count.
Yeah. No, I would, like I said, I agree. That is a process that still would be the joint ISO CPUC process. But the other is part of this would be is that you're at least getting, so not only thermal resources and potential as storage as well, but also the potential for imports to sell this product. And you could do similar things with respect to imports, in the sense that you could have, the maximum values for annual firm energy that they could sell to the extent that you're, concerned. I mean, what we're trying to do is set up a set of circumstances that you're qualifying people that at the end of the day, when you've bought what you need to meet demand, you're quite confident that the resources that are there that sold that can actually serve that. And that first step is, like I said, is I think is very necessary to the process to get guys like you, and for good reason, comfort that that's what's going to happen. Maybe over time, 15 years from now, when when we don't need to do that. But I agree that initially it's very important.
Yeah, and I don't want to belabor the fact, or the point to some degree, but turning it a little bit to local. I mean, I certainly the local construct, the local RA construct, as I understand it, doesn't have very much of a tie at all to energy market prices, and so it's very much, there are very much restrictions that are put on by the ISO in terms of being able to deal with very, very extreme what-if situations, and making sure that there is a procurement to handle those extreme local situations, which almost never arise in the actual operation of the market. And so I'm a little concerned about, or wonder about, sort of how well this would work for local constraints, particularly the way that the ISO has set up the local RA framework.
Yeah, I mean, that is something that I guess I would say is a topic for a longer discussion. But I certainly think that the so what I will say is the mechanism does build in a strong financial incentive for all of the generators collectively to avoid those kinds of local reliability events. Then the other would be is there's also the ability of a backstop that the IRP process could order something local to be built. And in that sense, I think that it is quite similar to it looks to me a lot like you can address it. You sort of have a high cost if this happens, and you have the ability to take remedial action if you're fearful that it won't.
So if I understand your answer, Frank, you're basically saying that you could allow lights to go out in a local area if the situation were to happen, but that would have
no. I would never want the lights to go out. I would simply say that prices will go very, very high in that local area. That will impose costs on all of the generators that have sold this contract. They recognize that. They therefore have a strong incentive not to let that happen. To the extent that you, as the ISO and CPUC, decide that you're still not happy with that, you can make an additional procurement of a certain variety to replace some of that energy with the energy from this resource that you procured, and then move forward.
Yeah, I understand that this is pretty much a planning exercise, but it does get at something that I don't know that I would probably need to learn more about, which is how you're thinking this interacts with the transmission and transmission planning and transmission system planning. And I think that's probably a topic that I'm not sure that you have articulated anything on, but it is something that I think needs to also be considered in the discussion. With that, I probably want to hand it back to Jamie, because I think I'm seeing questions pop up.
Thank you, Peter. So we're going to end this section of the workshop and open Q&A up to attendees. I know that we do have several questions that haven't been answered that have come in. So I'm going to actually pass it over to Simone to start going through some of these questions and unmute participants if needed.
Okay, yeah, we do have one hand up, so why don't we start with Doug Carpa? You're unmuted now.
Great, I hope you can hear me. Yeah, this is Dr. Doug Carpa from Peninsula Clean Energy. And I just wanted, I guess my fundamental question is whether this construct actually solves the problem that was laid out initially. Perhaps because I don't really understand like all the mechanics of it, but at first blush, it seems that, as a load serving entity, if I understand correctly, we're going to be taking an allocation of whatever comes out of the market, which are these strip products, right, that suppliers are providing into the market. And then the suppliers are in turn, because no generator is going to match a particular strip of load exactly, they're going to be in the business essentially of portfolio planning and procurement in order to supply their strip, but they have the option of going to the market, which seems to be very much the same position that load serving entities are in today. So I'm wondering, the first part of the question is, if you have these suppliers who are mixing and matching their own supply plus whatever it is they're buying out of the market, don't they have the same set of incentives that creates this reliability externality that load serving entities have today? We're just shifting those incentives to a different group of entities with this complex structure. So that seems to be, I think, probably the first question, is this really going to solve the problem? And I think also that if you've got these suppliers who are all out there constructing these portfolios, that means that instead the CPUC, instead of regulating 40 some LSEs, they're going to have to regulate hundreds of these suppliers because they need to make sure that what they're buying is accurate. And are they engaged in forward contracting for all of their energy? And are they meeting the RP and it's sort of RPS requirements? So I think have to question brass tacks, if you really are going to have this scheme do all the things that are currently regulatory requirements of LSEs today, I'm not sure it's going to be any simpler to do it this way.
Yeah, I would invite you to read the paper that I submitted to the PUC to clarify, because basically, yeah, okay. So, I mean, remember that, and then there's a number of papers cited there that will help you understand how forward contracts work and how they influence the incentive of market participants, because that's the fundamental characteristic of the mechanism, is that having a forward contract quantity, as it's shown here in the slides that I've written up, it effectively provides you, as you can see, if you look in the slide is on the second one for a generator, go to this right here, and you can see that to the extent that I am short relative to my contract position, I want to keep the spot price low. How do I keep that spot price low? I keep that spot price low by bidding in capacity at my marginal cost up to my contract quantity. And the next step is so, okay, we've got all generators who have contracts bidding in their units up to that contract quantity at marginal cost, and we've ensured that the sum of the contract quantities is equal to system demand. We've got system demand being satisfied at essentially the highest marginal cost of those units that bid in at their marginal cost. So that's the sense in which we're at a system-wide basis addressing the resource adequacy issue, is that all generators have a strong, are effectively incented to offer in. And then, this just and then makes this, will automatically then make this efficient make versus buy decision. So the times that a thermal generator's marginal cost is below the price, they'll basically be out of the market and they'll buy out of the market. And in times when the price is above their marginal cost, they'll be in the market and selling, but they'll be offering in at all. They have a strong incentive at all times to be offering in at their marginal cost.
Yeah, so there is supply out there. I mean, I think the point that Eric raised, which is that the real penalty for non-performing, or if there's simply not, if like generators assume there's supply out there and there isn't, the penalty of that is the lights go out, right? It's not that.
Right, but then the price goes up if there's no generators out there and that unit gets turned on.
Right. Well, that's the same incentive as load serving entities. I mean, we also, if we have exposure to the spot prices, we have that same dynamic. And it's maybe not critical enough.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's the whole purpose is like I said, is you've purchased a sufficient amount of resources that will be bidding in at least that amount of energy at a competitive price, and that amount of competitive energy each hour of the year, it sums up to, for each hour of the year, to system demand. That's the sense in which you've got adequate energy.
And I think the thing is that it's sort of balancing, I'm just thinking through this, but balancing the approach of having suppliers go out and do this versus having LSEs have these requirements. Both of those are predicated on the notion that whoever's doing the procurement or whoever, buying the energy is responding to prices and building stuff to make sure that there's enough resource. And then it's just a question of like, who do we put the requirements on to make sure that happens, and whether the market is adequate to get this done. And I think as Jamie has pointed out, we're in a situation where it's like, it doesn't really look like the market's getting this done right now. So if that's the case, then the CPUC would have to put requirements on the suppliers to say, thou shalt go out build stuff. That aspect of it, I'm not sure is going to change all that much. Anyway, I'll think about it more. Thank you so much.
It has nothing about telling suppliers to build stuff. I'm not sure how you got that impression.
Well, if you don't, it's a question of whether it will actually get built, right?
If a seller of a forward contract wants to get paid, they have to supply the energy associated with, either buy it or sell the energy associated with the energy they sold. That's how they get paid. So if you've sold it in advance and you're not, you're going to build the capacity, or if it turns out that demand falls and you don't need to build the capacity, then you're good to go. But either way, you're on the hook financially. And I guess I believe that it's financial incentives that make people do things they want. I mean, the fact of the matter, during all times in California, there was clearly adequate capacity to serve demand. It's just that financial incentives did not exist, or were not high powered enough to make that demand be met in California.
Yeah, I wonder. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Doug. Simone, do you want to go to the next question?
Sure. And if anyone else would like to ask a question verbally, you can use the raise hand function. We've had several people curious how storage fits into this construct. One question here is that storage is priced on price spreads, not a price, and increasingly gas units must buy fuel in the spot market. Since the fuel cost of both of these types of resources cannot be firmed, how do we contract forward?
Again, this is the storage unit could potentially receive a annual firm energy value, just like it currently would receive a firm capacity value. That would limit how much of this product it would sell. It would then, essentially that would be the revenue stream that it would be getting, and then it would be free to operate in the short-term market to essentially the same way as I'm showing right here, is they would be offering in their opportunity costs to pump and their opportunity cost to or to discharge and their opportunity cost to charge into the short-term market, and they would operate pretty much just like any other generation unit. Of course, it's a bit more complicated as a storage unit to manage, when to withdraw from the grid versus when to inject to the grid. But it pretty much would work the same way, is that they can sell this product and then they have hedging for their actual pattern of production relative to their forward contract obligation, that they may want to sign deals with other entities, marketers and others to hedge, or they could manage that themselves. They have the flexibility to do that.
Okay. How do we tie this to reliability metrics like LLE? Is the idea that we use a certain load forecast, such as 1 in 5 or 1 in 10, to achieve a desired level of reliability?
Again, that I'll leave the computation of ELLC to the engineers. It always strikes me as Jim said, lots of assumptions that you need to make that may make you somewhat uncomfortable. But sometimes you need to try to get a ballpark, and that's basically what you're going to need to do if you want to, under this scheme, as you would do under a capacity scheme, you're trying to make an assessment as to what can this resource provide of this product, and that is the maximum amount of this product.
I'm actually gonna stop you. I think the question is related to setting the requirement based on a loss of load study, not the valuing of a resource based on ELCC. So whether or not we should be using, a 1 in 5 or 1 in 10, and whether or not we could use a.
What do you mean by
can I jump in here? Because I think this was an element of the proposal that I was confused by, but now understand. So the key here is that correct me if I'm wrong, Frank, that the product being sold is to cover 100% of load, whatever it may be. And so at the time the seller agrees to do this, they do not know exactly what quantity they are taking on to supply.
You're close, Jim. You're close. Is that the idea is that sellers are always selling a fixed quantity of the energy. If you like, the entity such as the CPUC determines how much of that to buy, when to buy. So it could buy, it could buy a certain amount of this energy. I recommended you come up with some estimate of how much you think you're going to need. You buy that, and then if it turns out that you bought too much, you can sell that back in the reconfiguration auction. It turns out you bought too little, you can buy more in the reconfiguration auction. And in both cases, you're just blending in what you think of it as the contract quantity is the actual sums to the actual demand in the hour. But the contract price is just the weighted average of the procurements that were made through these various auctions.
But okay, then that goes back to what the original question by this person is okay. So it's the PUC's buying a collection of fixed quantity commitments.
Just one.
Well, that aggregate up to just one total.
They're buying annual load. That's it.
Yeah, but you just said that some of that is that it's adjusted over time through a different sequence of procurements.
No, as I said, is that before the year starts, you buy. After the year starts, you just do true up 2 times. That's it. You could do more, but that's the minimum.
Right, but the question was, how much do you buy? Do you buy to a 1 in 5? Do you buy to a 1 in 2? A 1 in, And I think it's a
the
different
more-
animal to buy energy to meet that versus say capacity to meet a 1 in 10.
Yeah. I mean, I'm perfectly fine to. I mean, I think that's. I would personally, given where we are right now in California, I would be more inclined to buy to the extreme extreme annual demand rather than to buy to not buy to the extreme annual demand, simply because I can sell back, and it better be safe than sorry. So my inclination, but again, that's something that I think the CPUC would really want to decide, but you can, and that's the part of the reason that I like the aspect of you buy a fixed quantity of annual energy, so that you can be particularly prudent if you'd like, and that you could say, well, we're concerned that electricity demand's going up much faster than we thought. We'll buy a little bit more than we think we're likely to need. And so what? In the reconfiguration, we can sell it back, and it'll raise the clearing price just a little bit. But that's insurance. It's worth it.
So can we think of this as a planning reserve margin that we could use an LOLE to set? An LOLE study to set? I think that's what the question is kind of coming back to is, or do we change the way we're thinking about planning and planning reserve margins?
I guess I would view it as, I view that as a separate issue, in that I view the planning reserve as more about your IRP goals, how much energy you buy, as how certain you want to believe that you're going to be able to meet that demand, because we all know that the firm capacity numbers are real squiggly. The annual firm energy numbers are somewhat squiggly. And so therefore, you may buy a little bit more of this product to ensure that the lights will stay on, in the same sense that you'll probably buy more under the capacity construct, more capacity to ensure that the lights stay on. And then in terms of reserve margin, I guess my argument there would be is I feel very much like let's get away from that concept, simply because it hopefully will have less and less meaning the more and more we're able to get automated demand response into the market, which there's absolutely no reason we shouldn't be able to, given that California has interval meters, California has high-tech controllable devices, it has communication. The only thing that's necessary is the pricing incentives to make that happen. That's what we need. This is consistent precisely with getting those pricing incentives in place.
Hey, Frank, this is Michelle. These go hand in hand, because I think maybe what people are struggling with is, what if you plan to a 1 in 10, a very conservative standard, but let's say you have a 1 in 35 weather year and an entirely west-wide heat wave. You're basically saying we have to then go to the market and buy out of the market, right?
Yeah. I mean, you will be potentially, the good news is, you will be potentially running out, but you could easily, if you see this coming, make an additional procurement at some time during the year. So for example, you bought 100, you see that system demand is going to get close to 100, you can initiate an additional procurement of annual energy, and buy enough to make sure you're good to go along the way. There's nothing that I would argue is against having that happen.
Okay, so assuming it exists, and I guess maybe paired with the demand response, you're saying, and if it doesn't exist, if you had LMP pricing that customers actually saw, they would reduce their demand in response to this, but that doesn't exist, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the problem is that customers and retailers have very little incentive to be flexible in when they consume, because there's no most of them are load profile build, and that gives you zero and only annual monthly average price incentive to reduce. Whereas if you're billing people based on their actual hourly consumption, if they reduce in the hour when the price is really high, they get the full benefit. And if they increase in the hour that the price is low, they get the full benefit. And that's what would, and then moreover, that could finance distributed storage investments, could finance load flexibility at the distribution level, all the things that clearly technology exists that we could do.
Under any RA paradigm, if you have a super extreme weather event, you're not going to have enough, unless you plan for a 1 in 10,000 weather event, which you just have a cost issue there. So there's always going to be some shortfall if you have, there's just, unless you want to spend so much money to plan for any possibility. I think the comments that came up in the Q&A right now are sort of follow where my questions were too, in the sense of if we're buying energy to meet, a 1 in 10, then the other 9/10 of the time we're going to have too much energy,
but that's insurance.
There's also a question of if we're buying 8670 1 in 10. I'm not sure even what that means, but we might have too much energy. Might that mean we have too much energy all 8760 hours? What are the cost implications of that?
Remember, it very minor. I mean, if you think your demand miss is at best maybe 5%, I mean, having looked at annual demand in California, a 5% annual difference in demand is massive. We don't have that kind of load growth at all. So basically, the point being is that you miss by 5%. Oh, you sell back 5% of what you bought in advance. That you don't even see that in the annual price that you clear against.
Are you saying a 5% over all 8760 hours?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, but
You're
what does that
annual
imply
demand
for
under the scheme.
Yeah, okay, but if you're targeting, we might be off by 5% on an annual average, but what does that mean for some of the critical hours?
Remember, Jim, the whole thing is that it's allocated to the realized pattern of actual demand. That's the key. So you're always the allocation of the contract
to?
Huh?
What is it procured to?
It is an annual product that you purchase for the entire year's demand. And then it is, as we show here, it is allocated according to the actual realized pattern of demand.
So, okay, so you're selling a fixed amount of energy, but the hour by hour breakdown is based upon the actual ex post realization.
Exactly.
All right, exactly. So we are back to my original. So back to the LOLE question then. It really comes down to moving what this scheme does then is move upstream to the generator the risk of having enough available to meet the peak supply.
Yes, because they're the guys that own supply.
Yeah, I just want to be clear.
Exactly. No, and we want to reward them for doing that. But because basically, but it also allows for the opportunity of load to go away. Because if you're a load and you can go away, you can sell back energy that you bought in advance in the short-term market. You can profit from reducing your demand. Because
there are lots of schemes where you could get the opportunity and that sort of thing. I think the key distinction here is as far as planning for reserve margins in a traditional sense of identifying certain critical hours and figuring out is this 1 in 10 or whatever, that really is moved out of the policy sort of oversight PUC process and upstream into the sellers of these energy contracts.
Well, because as I would hope that you would agree, I mean, planning reserve is increasingly meaningless as you get more and more intermittent renewables. I mean, that's the whole point here, is we want to make sure that effectively, as I showed earlier in the presentation, I mean, great, you had a 27% for solar during the period where the blackouts occurred, but solar wasn't producing much at all during that time period. So it's nice that you compensated solar for 27%, but they didn't provide it, and that's going to be pretty constant, if it's dark when the extreme events occur. And so the idea is we want to say, look, a generating community, we are going to buy what we think we need to meet demand from you. We know that you guys can get, understand how the system works, what risks you face. You can trade these risks in a secondary market to hopefully come up with a more efficient dispatch, because you have sold forward this demand to consumers, and consumers are therefore, in the aggregate at least, hedged against that the price spikes that will occur. Those price spikes that will occur are going to be borne by you, and you have an incentive to manage them. You can price in the fact that you are going to have to manage those price spikes in your willingness to supply this product. Hopefully that we went to 5.
I agree. LOLE is becoming an increasing challenge, but that's really because of trying to predict what the resource capabilities are across sort of a dynamic time frame. This sort of goes a step further, which is not even planning for a specific peak demand number. That peak demand number itself is sort of moved upstream.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree. But that doesn't mean that the pre-qualification process to participate in the auction cannot account for that kind of issue. That's all I would say. So I'm sorry, Jamie. I'll be quiet.
Yeah.
Somebody's getting feedback.
I had muted my phone. So we do have about 5 minutes left, and I do see a lot of questions that aren't answered. Maybe we could get to a few of them. I see one. Can someone speak to the forward energy contracting construct as it relates to having resources with ramp requirements needed during a given period?
The ramp requirements are managed through the short-term market. I mean, this is just a financial obligation. And so going back again to this picture, I mean, this is right here is the financial risk that the generator faces, is that the hourly variable profits of the generation unit owners look like this. And so if you have a ramp rate, it is going to limit what you can sell actually in the short-term market, or what we'll call Q spot right there in this middle equation where my mouse is. And therefore, it exposes you a bit more potentially to the spot price. Could be a favorable or unfavorable spot price, but that's basically how it works. I mean, these are purely just money going back and forth, but that money going back and forth is creating incentives for behavior that, we've discussed throughout the presentation.
All right. One more question, and then I apologize. We're not going to get to all these before the end of the day, but we can take them back. We're going to save them and hopefully be able to respond to some of them and post them in the Q&A log on our website. I believe that's possible. So let's see. Would suppliers who bid into the SFPFC auction be able to bid for monthly or seasonal granularity, or is it only annual energy?
I mean, I think the simplest version of the product is just annual. Working out how participation could work for shorter horizons is certainly possible and could be built into the mechanism. It just makes it a bit more complicated, but there's no sort of fundamental difficulty of essentially bringing shorter horizon products into this mechanism. So as a supplier could sell only in this quarter, you know, that could be built in. It's just the mathematics and the accounting gets a bit more complicated and would take much longer to explain.
All right. I'm tempted to do one more question. Can we answer it short? I guess it depends on the question. So this is a question on retail choice or retail competition. How does this proposal promote retail competition if, one, all retailers are obliged to pay for energy at the auction price, 2, IRP central procurement, and 3, little to no bilateral contracting? Where is the competition besides limited short-term hedging?
I mean, I guess I would argue it's no different now from what's true with the capacity construct, is that everybody's got a capacity obligation, so you could make the same argument there. I'm just simply saying everybody's got this same forward contracting obligation. But remember, your load shape is not the same as your contracting obligation. That's where you're going to make your money, by potentially attracting retail customers that come closer potentially to matching that, to finding customers who are flexible and selling that flexibility into the short-term market. That flexibility will have much more value in this market rather than in a market with a capacity mechanism. So basically, retailing will be profitable and will be incented, because you're creating essentially revenue streams through this mechanism for retailers that are certainly more lucrative than would be the case in a capacity construct, where, you know, no price volatility, just pay your capacity construct and you're done. Here, you've got a bit more work to do, and you will be rewarded for it.
All right, well, we'll leave it at that with that last question. And Frank, if you don't mind slipping to the last slide, or the second to last slide of the deck, I'm just going to quickly go over next steps by reviewing our track 3B2 calendar. So revised proposals were submitted on the 18th. The next step is to have comments on the revised proposals that were submitted on the 15th of January. And then the plan is to have a set of workshops in early to mid-February on the proposals that were submitted. So parties that did submit proposals in track 3B2, we look forward to talking about your proposals as well through workshops in early to mid-February. And again, well, the decision's not on there, but there will be steps in the process to revise the proposal or allow for revisions in the proposals and take comments again and reply comments, ultimately landing with a June 2021 decision. And so with that, I thank you for everybody's participation in today's workshop. And please enjoy your lunch break and the rest of your day. And I look forward to future discussions with you all. Thank you.
Jamie, are you there? Oh, is everybody off now, or no? Is it just us?
No. Yeah, everybody's still on. I think the participants and panelists are starting to drop off.
I could offer that if there's like groups of people that have further questions, I'd be happy to schedule a Zoom call to answer their questions.
Oh, that would be great.
Okay.
I will coordinate with you on that if I hear back from parties about, wanting further details.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Sean and Jim. Thanks a lot.
Yes.
And all the Eric and Peter and Nick and I'm forgetting and Matt, of course. How can I forget Matt? So thanks. All right. Bye-bye.